Click subscribe right now so we can bring you even more Wild West full-length audiobooks. Leave a comment below and check out how to get a free copy of Wrangler, a Western adventure. Chapter 1. On this spring morning, Cody Houston felt the tension blanketing Ash Fork like a wave of oppressive heat. For a Saturday, there were very few rigs and saddle horses at the hitch racks, and he smiled grimly at this observation. It was better not to be around if leads started whining, and some expected guns to pop today if he brought in the carload of barbed wire as he planned. Houston turned into the elite livery and boarding stable and slid off his short-coupled bay quarter horse, a lean man with a face more grave than one would expect on someone on the near side of 30. His corduroy pants hung loosely on his long legs, and the flannel shirt, open at the neck, showed a touch of shaving powder he hadn't wiped off after using his razor. There was something about him that suggested a pine tree that had weathered more storms than its years warranted. A sober ruggedness trouble hadn't been able to destroy. Old Ron Greer took his horse and remarked, "So you're really going to start fencing, huh?" Houston looked at him with uncomfortable directness. "That's what I planned." "Why shouldn't I?" Greer said, "Oh, no reason at all. A man's got a right to fence his own land if he wants to." "That's what I thought." Old Greer led the horse back to the stable, mumbling to himself, "Why shouldn't he?" "Because Brock Silas says no, that's why." Houston watched the retreating figure of the liveryman, rolling a cigarette as he speculated on the gossip likely running through town and the outlying districts. They were probably laying bets on whether he dared fence his property and Ginny Sterling's against Silas's opposition. He scratched a match, lit his cigarette in cupped hands, blew the match out carefully, and left the stable, walking down to Merle Roberson's trading company. In the store, he passed down a lane of nail and staple kegs, and kegs of horseshoes with 3 or 4 shoes hanging on their rims, past a platform stacked high with sacks of flour and dress goods bags, and reached a railed-off corner where Roberson sat behind a flat-top desk making out checks for bills. He entered through a swing gate and sat in a straight-back wooden chair beside Roberson's desk. Roberson scratched his name on a check, pinned it to a bill, addressed the envelope, and shoved the bill and check inside before carefully licking and stamping the envelope, all before looking up. Houston picked up an upright tin cigar box with a picture of an eagle with a snake in its mouth, and the words Mexican Commerce printed on it. He took a cigar out of the box, bit off the end, lit it, and thought that Roberson was taking extra time with the envelope to plan what he would say. Then Roberson laid the envelope aside, leaned back in his chair, and smiled, a little thin, a little uneasy. "Well, what can I do for you, Cody?" Houston pulled a list from his pocket and read it aloud. "I want you to put this stuff out on your back dock for me to pick up when we're done unloading the car," he said. 4 pairs of post-hole diggers, 4 of those new fencing pliers with the cutters and staple puller built into them, and about 3 kegs of fencing staples. Roberson jotted the items down on a sheet of paper silently, then looked up over his glasses. "You sure you're going on with this, Cody?" "Why not?" Houston returned with a touch of impatience. "You can't hold back progress any more than you can hold back a rain cloud, even if you had the right to. And nobody's got a right to tell me I can't fence my own land if I want to." "No," Roberson agreed. "But when you're doing it just to injure a neighbor." "Is that what Silas is claiming?" Houston snapped. "I thought you could see clearer than that." Roberson shrugged. "That's what he's saying, and you won't talk. What can we believe?" "All right, I'll tell you once, and you can suit yourself which side to believe," Houston said briskly. "I know you do business with everybody, and you've got to sit on the fence, but at least you'll know the truth." He picked up Roberson's pencil and an empty envelope, drawing a rough sketch. "Pecan Creek runs through our 2 places for a distance of 8 miles, through 10 sections of my land and 6 sections of Sterling land. Silas's 10 sections lie to the north, and when the ravines are dry, his cattle have to cross our land to reach the creek for water. Here's the trouble. When the ravines are dry, his cattle come to the creek to drink, but they graze near the water, meaning they're eating our grass. So, at the very time when our graze is scarcest, we've got to watch Silas's stock eating it up. He's got twice as much stock as we have, so he's getting more good off our graze than we are. We're just feeding him while we have to sell off early because his stock has eaten all our grass. We either fence or go broke, so I'm fencing. And what will Silas do for water? He claims you'll cut him off entirely, and he can't raise cattle without water. That's not so. He can do what we're doing, dam up the ravines and catch his runoff water in ponds. He doesn't want to spend the money to do that. But it's against the law to fence a public stream, and we're not doing that. Also, by law, we'll leave a crossroad at every section line. Silas's cattle can use those crossroads to reach the creek. He knows that. He's mad because his cows won't fatten on our grass anymore. Roberson sighed. I see. But it means war, Cody. You're right legally, but you'll never make an open-range man see that. I found that out. I tried to show him that we'd all make more money under a fence, but he can't see it. Silas doesn't make threats, Roberson warned, but you know he'll fight. He won't back down from his position. I know that. But I can't back down without quitting the cattle business entirely. Roberson ran his hand through his hair. It means bloodshed if you try to unload that car of wire. You know Silas is in town. I supposed he would be. Well, if you're determined, I guess nothing short of a bullet will stop you. Did you know Ginny is back? She's at the hotel, waiting for somebody to take her out home. I suppose Silas will see that she gets out all right. Not if she hears about what's happening. I'd better see her then. And get her out of town, Roberson said. She'd take you and Silas and butt your heads together if she knew what was up. She wouldn't have let you and Bob Burnham talk her into fencing along with you if she'd known it would cause trouble. Houston got to his feet. This part of the job would have been over by now if the wire had come in time. I told Bob to write and see if he could persuade her to stay at her aunt's another week. Roberson was thoughtful for a moment, then asked with sudden resolve, Maybe this is none of my business, but I'd like to know just what's behind this. It's more than just fencing, isn't it? The fencing angle is enough, isn't it? Houston countered. For the public, yes. But not for me. After all, I'm Ginny's uncle and her only male relative. I've got a kind of personal interest, I suppose. Houston made a quick decision. All right then. But what I tell you has to be in confidence. I'm not known for talking too much. Well, I can't prove a thing, but I'm sure of what I'm saying. You know Silas. He's hungry for $1 and won't let anything stop him from getting it as long as he's got a leg to stand on. He wants Ginny, but I don't believe he'd want her if it wasn't for her land. And you want her too. I don't, Houston replied quickly. We were raised together. I've been fighting with her since she was old enough to annoy me. I'd just as soon marry a wildcat. But I like her as a friend and neighbor. I don't want to see her hurt, and if she doesn't wake up, Silas is going to hurt her. He's older than she is and probably has a lot more sense, Roberson admitted. But after all, she's grown and has a right to do what she likes. It looks like you're trying to protect her whether she wants it or not. I am, Houston admitted. I've got reason to believe Maddox Shaw killed her dad, just to get him out of Silas's way, so Silas could have a clear shot at her and her land. That's a serious charge, Roberson reminded him. I know it is, and I can't prove it. That's why I hadn't spoken of it before, and why I told you this had to be in confidence. Are you trying to prove it? Not directly. I know I couldn't convince Ginny of Silas's guilt just by talking to her. But I can make Silas show his hand so she can see it. That's the only chance I've got. But do you have to? Why can't you just drop it if you can't prove it? Because if I dropped it, there'd be no stopping Silas. He'd destroy Ginny, take her land, and then he'd go on to control this whole community and ruin everyone else, including me. He's like an octopus, and he's got to be stopped before he gets too strong. Roberson pondered this and then spoke sadly. I don't question you, Cody. But you're biting off a big slice of trouble. I don't know how you and Burnham persuaded Ginny to fence her land without talking with Silas first, but when she finds out Silas is against it, she's going to be hard to manage. So you'll have her against you, even while you're fighting for her. I know it, Houston admitted. But we never could have gotten started if we hadn't done it that way. Burnham sees it my way, and he talked her into it. He got her to go visit her aunt, then wrote to her and got her to agree to fence. We'd have had the job done by now, if we could have gotten the wire in time. We'll just have to face things as they come. They'll come fast enough, Roberson sighed. Everyone in town is expecting a gunfight the minute you start unloading that car of wire. Houston looked out the rear window of the office. Down the block, a railroad spur came to an end with the two rails drawn together and upward to a post. A small, low station building and shed stood unpainted and dreary at the rail's end, and to the left of it, a freight dock. Still farther on were a series of cattle pens and loading chutes. The pens held 25 or 30 horses, and more than a dozen wagons stood around, their empty shafts on the ground and their horses' harness on the spring seats. Houston had scoured the countryside to find enough wagons, teams, and men willing to drive them, despite the opposition. Wonder when they'll get it in, he asked over his shoulder. Any time now. I phoned Kiowa, and the switch engine has already left there. Houston went out and walked down the dusty boardwalk toward the Rattlesnake Bar in the next block. As he approached the corner by the Drover's Bank, he saw 3 men running down the lone cross street in the direction of the railroad station. He turned his gaze toward them. He saw a circle of men gathered, drawn by the scent of trouble like buzzards to a dying calf. He made his way toward them. As he got closer, he heard a taunting voice urging, "Give it to him, Bartlett." He asked for it. Whip him all over the street. Houston shoved his way through the crowd and got into the inner circle, where he saw Bartlett, one of the drivers he'd hired, standing with his legs wide apart. His hat lay upside down in the dust at his feet, his hair mussed, and his shirt and overalls covered in dirt. A stream of blood trickled from his nose and down the corner of his mouth. Facing him was Maddox Shaw, a man who lived on Pecan Creek and often worked for Silas. Maddox had the cunning of a fox in the body of a grizzly. Having already hit the unarmed Bartlett, the fence post chopper, he now stood back, unbuckling his gun belt with a sly, hungry grin. He handed his gun and belt to a man beside him and began slowly rolling up his sleeves, savoring every moment. "So," he said tauntingly, "you call me a liar right in front of my friends." "I didn't call you a liar," Bartlett replied heatedly, though fear was clear in his voice. "I was just minding my own business." Maddox grinned at the crowd. "He calls me a liar again. Says I lied when I said he called me a liar. That's twice now, and I can't stand here and let him do it every time I open my mouth, can I? I didn't call you a liar in the first place. I wasn't being unfriendly to the pan, because I tried to make a day's wages hauling a load for Houston." "That's right, you did. But that's the same as calling me a liar, because I told you it would be unfriendly to me and Brock if you hauled that load. Barbed wire. You're hauling barbed wire for Houston, and you're saying I was lying when I called that an unfriendly act. Well, friend, you just can't keep calling me a liar. My self-respect won't allow it, and now I'm going to bust you wide open. I'm going to rip your skin clean off with my fingernails and throw it over a fence to dry. I'll tear all the flesh off that lanky skeleton of yours, chase you down the street in your bare bones, and then yank them off one at a time to throw to the dogs. Maybe after that you'll call me a liar again." The boy from the hills was battling himself. It was as clear to him as it was to the onlookers that he was in for a brutal beating, and his instincts told him to run and save his skin. But the native pride of youth held him back, and the conflict between these desires left his face gray and his tongue dry. Maddox enjoyed the effect he had on the youth, eyeing him with amused satisfaction, giving the crowd time to appreciate it. He was in no hurry to start the fight. Like a cat with a rat, he wanted to squeeze every last drop of pleasure from the scene, partly because he liked it, partly for the crowd's reaction. Houston turned his eyes to the crowd, sweeping them with a critical gaze. He saw cruel anticipation in their faces. It was a queer thing, he thought. They were just plain men, some from town, some from the country, men who did their day's work and had their day's fun. They were no better or worse than any other men. But they weren't individuals now. They were running in a pack like wolves. They had the wolf smell on them, and they craved blood. None of them had any personal liking for the brutish Maddox Shaw, who had a dark past they all knew, but now he was their champion, set to satisfy their bloodlust. That's the way men are. Houston saw clearly what was going on beneath the surface of this street fight, though the crowd didn't. He knew Shaw saw it too. Despite his brutishness, Shaw had a streak of animal cunning and instinctively understood the forces at play around him, making him all the more dangerous. Shaw, knowing the men despised him, got a grim satisfaction out of seeing them waiting for him to satisfy their animal instincts while hating him for doing it. He knew they wanted the youth from the hills to beat him into a pulp, but they knew, and he knew, that wasn't going to happen. Houston had broken into the circle where Shaw hadn't seen him, but gradually the crowd's eyes focused on Houston, reading the significance of his sudden appearance. All attention shifted to him. Shaw, seeing this, turned and spotted Houston for the first time. Houston stood at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, hand far from his gun. Shaw's face changed, the anticipatory grin vanishing. He stopped rolling his sleeves, letting his hands drop to his sides as he studied Houston, calculating what changes this new presence had brought. Shaw was figuring out what this sudden shift would mean for him. As the two men faced each other, an uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. Houston said easily, "Hello, Bartlett. How's everything?" Then he turned to Shaw. "How are you, Shaw?" Maddox grabbed the chance for more time to think, his face breaking into a smile. "How about yourself, Cody? Long time no see." Houston's eyes met Shaw's as he replied casually, "No, I don't get to town much. Been busy, riding here and there, up around Pecan Creek. You ought to ride up that way sometime. Good hunting." Maddox Shaw's thick lips loosened as he watched Houston closely. He took in the words, turning them over in his mind. Cody Houston was telling him something, warning him. Shaw knew he needed more time to figure out the warning before he could act. "Yeah," he said softly. "I might take my gun and ride up that way sometime. You like to shoot up there, don't you?" Shaw kept the easy smile on his face while his eyes tried to read Houston's meaning. "Sure. I like to shoot wherever there's something to shoot." Houston didn't reply, and the crowd grew restless. They sensed there was more to the exchange, but couldn't figure it out. They tried to read Shaw's face, then Houston's, but found nothing. It made them impatient. They wanted more words to examine, to understand what lay behind them. But Houston left them hanging, refusing to continue in that direction. They looked at Maddox Shaw, knowing Houston had thrown it into his lap, and they wanted to see what he'd do with it. It was his next move, and they shuffled, waiting. Maddox saw all this and knew it was his turn. His eyes shifted from Houston to the crowd, then to Bartlett, who stood waiting to see how long his reprieve would last. Bartlett was right in front of him, and Shaw could continue the fight. The crowd was eager to see if he would, knowing it would raise his standing, if he got past Houston's cryptic words. Shaw weighed it all, then shrugged indifferently. He laughed. "Well, I'll be seeing you around, Houston." He took his gun from the man holding it, buckled it around his hips, and pushed through the crowd toward the Parisian bar. The crowd let out a collective breath, deflating like a carcass left too long in the sun. Someone muttered, "Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd see the day someone whipped Maddox Shaw without throwing a punch." The crowd began to dissolve, like a clod of dirt in the rain. Another man, as they drifted away, replied, "He didn't whip Maddox. There's something fishy." They were talking over our heads, and Houston must have threatened him with something he knew. Maddox got it, and didn't dare continue with Bartlett. Wonder what it was. You think that's it? Has to be. No one around here can take Shaw in a fistfight, and Shaw ain't scared of anything that walks on two legs. Houston gave him something to think about, and Shaw decided to wait and figure it out before doing anything. I'm telling you, this isn't over. I'd have liked to see that fight. I wouldn't. Shaw would have butchered that kid, brutal and vicious. You're probably right. Maybe it wasn't much for us to be proud of, standing around waiting to watch a kid get his guts stomped by a man twice his size and twice as mean. Still, we'll see a fight yet, the other promised. You can't leave something like that unresolved. Maybe not. Suppose Houston does bring in that wire like he said. Not that he's likely to cross Brock Silas, but if he does, I doubt Silas would leave enough of him for Shaw to even work on. Chapter 2. Houston and young Bartlett walked toward the Rattlesnake Bar. Houston said to the youth, "I told you all to stick together and not go unarmed. This is not a game we're playing. How'd he manage to get you cut out of the herd?" "I broke a harness coming in last night and had to get a new one, put it on my harness. Shaw rode into town by himself, saw me there, and came back after he tied his horse. He caught me headed back to the bunch." "Where's your gun?" "I left it in my wagon." "I told you about being caught without it. I figured if Shaw jumped me and I had my gun on, he'd kill me for sure. I can't outshoot a regular gunman, so I took it off. He couldn't very well shoot me unarmed, and I'd rather take a whipping than get shot." "You've got more sense than I thought you had," Houston admitted as they entered the Rattlesnake. His men were there, 15 or 20 cowhands, log haulers, and farmers who'd let the high wages Houston offered overcome their doubts about his ability to buck Brock Silas. They all wore guns. Houston joined Bob Burnham at the end of the bar. Bob, in his 60s, grizzled and quiet, had been foreman for old Abner Sterling until Ab's death. He stayed on to run the place for Ginny, saying she needed a boss to keep her in line, though the truth was she ran him. Burnham said, "Silas has got his men over at the Parisian. He's got some new hands, pretty salty looking. Probably 20, counting old and new. Think we ought to go through with it? You know any better time?" Burnham shrugged. "Ginny will have a fit when she comes home and finds out there's been a battle." "She's home. At the hotel. How about sending one of your men to get her started to the ranch before this thing breaks?" Burnham groaned. "Why don't you? If she smells a mouse, she'll be down here jerking both our hair out by the roots." He lifted his hat, mopping his bald head. "If she's here, we won't move a spool of that wire while Silas is against it. She's dead set against trouble. I got her out of town long enough for the wire to be delivered, but you couldn't get it here in time. So it's up to you. Then she can just pull up a chair and watch us unload it," Houston said evenly. "She's got almost as much money tied up in it as I have, and I'm not going to let it rust on the siding. She can stop us from fencing her land. Sure, if you can't keep her convinced it's the right thing to do. It's me against Silas, and she's got a lot of faith in him." "Too much," Houston admitted. "If we could have gotten that wire shipped in time to have the fencing finished, I think she'd have seen Silas for what he is by now." "But we didn't," Burnham mourned, "and now the fat's in the fire. I bet we don't fence an acre." "We'll fence all of mine no matter what she says," Houston answered. "If Brock Silas lets us," Burnham grinned. "He's already spoken in public, and he can't afford not to back it up." "In that case," Houston said, "it's just as good as done. Let's get the boys moving." He called to his foreman at the other end of the bar. "Jess, you boys ready?" Jess Howard, slightly less than middle-aged, was unnaturally stooped and bow-legged, with long, mournful mustaches under a large nose. His deliberate movements gave the impression that life wasn't worth the effort, but he went about it as though resigned to the fact. Jess wiped the beer foam off his whiskers and shuffled over. "Yeah. We've got enough men to unload the car onto the dock, and enough wagons to move it all in 2 trips if this bunch stands hitched. They're not too happy about what Silas is going to do. They're trying to convince themselves he won't show up, that he was bluffing." "Silas doesn't bluff," Houston said. "He told me he wouldn't let me unload that wire, and a dozen people heard him. He can't afford not to try." "I was afraid of that," Jess sighed. "Well," he stopped as every man in the room paused. The familiar hoot of the switch engine's whistle filled the air, as it had done once a week for years when it rounded the bend at Pinetop Mountain. But this time, it was bringing more than mail and goods for Roberson's trading store. Each grunt of the old engine brought war closer to Ash Fork. Houston's eyes scanned the room, gauging the men he had on hand. What he saw was not encouraging. These were woodsmen, farmers, and a few riders from friendly ranches. There wasn't a hired gunman among them. Probably none had ever looked a man in the eye over the sights of a pistol, and all of them hoped they wouldn't have to, knowing they wouldn't fare well. Most had been persuaded into this, believing it wouldn't come to a showdown. Now they knew better. "You boys drink up and go get your teams harnessed," Houston said cheerfully. "About 6 at a time can spell each other, unloading the wire." The men hastily finished their drinks, as though it might be their last. Houston added, "Anybody who wants to back out, do it now before we head to the car." None did. As the men filed out, Houston turned to Burnham. "You going to handle Ginny?" Burnham wiped his mouth nervously. "Cody, she can outsmart me on anything. I'd rather face Silas's men." "Why don't you see her?" Houston grinned ruefully. "I probably wouldn't do any better. Let's just forget it and hope she stays out of the way." "Don't count on it," Burnham warned. "Ready." They followed the men out of the saloon. The group walked close together, casting nervous glances at the Parisian bar, where Silas's men were holed up. 2 faces showed through the window watching, but no one came out. Houston's group rounded the corner and headed for the station, where the engine slowed down with a freight car and an empty gondola in tow. At the station, the men scattered to their wagons. Burnham broke the seal on the freight car while Houston inspected the gondola. The train crew from Kiowa knew something was about to happen, for the engine stopped at a distance after Houston signed the bill of lading. The crew waited in the cab, expecting to witness something unfold. Burnham noticed this and said to Houston, "Well, they've got something to get away in when the trouble starts. We may have to hitch a ride with them." Together, Houston and Burnham shoved the big sliding door of the boxcar back, revealing a load of shining spools of barbed wire. The first wagon rolled up and came alongside the car. Houston called to 6 men, and they put on leather gloves, climbed into the car of wire, and broke the shoring out, their guns flapping on their hips. As the other men hitched their teams, they hung around the open door of the car while those inside began passing the wire spools out to the first wagon. The wagon was half loaded before Houston called a halt. "Here they come, men," he said quietly. "You fellows in the car, get your gloves off. You can't handle a gun with heavy gloves." A stir went through the men as they spread out along the side of the car. Houston cautioned them, "Don't get panicky and start pulling triggers. We'll wait and see what Silas has got to say. There may not be any shooting at all, and make sure you don't shoot until you're shot at." Houston dropped down from the car and walked toward the approaching group. They were on horseback, moving at a leisurely pace, with Brock Silas at the head of a column of about 20 men. Houston stood and waited until they came up. About 100 feet from the car, the column halted, and Silas rode on until he was within 10 paces of Houston, then stopped his horse. Silas was a big man riding a big horse. His face was clean and pink, well filled out, and he wore fine whipcord riding breeches and a tan shirt open at the neck. His hair was midnight black under his oyster-white Stetson, and his large, deep blue eyes were set under heavy black brows. He was cool and unhurried, with a solidity about him that suggested granite. Houston looked at him carefully and saw again, as he had often seen before, that the man did not know fear nor how to turn aside from an objective he had once decided on. Silas looked over Houston's small collection of men and rightly measured them as no great threat to him. Satisfied that his own men were more than a match for them, he turned his attention back to Houston. "You're still determined to start a little war?" he asked. "No. I'm not trying to start a war. I'm just going to fence my ranch." "There's no use in repeating what I told you," Silas said persuasively. "Barbed wire will ruin this range, and I don't intend to be ruined." "We've gone over that," Houston replied. "You could catch all the water you need if you dam your ravines or dig ponds. I can't let myself be ruined because you don't want to spend money to catch your water. We've gone over this before. Now I'm telling you for the last time, don't unload another spool of that wire. If you do, my men are going to stop you, and you will be responsible for the deaths of a lot of your neighbors. This is it, Houston, the last word." Houston's eyes swept over Silas's crew, with Maddox Shaw at the head. "Looks like you've got a bunch of new hands," he observed softly. "Gun hands, I'd call 'em." Silas smiled. "You called it right. You've asked for war, so I've taken the wise course and brought in half a dozen boys who know something about war. You can't blame me under the circumstances, can you?" "No," Houston admitted. "But before you move them into action, I'd suggest that you look over my reserves." He turned and shouted at the apparently empty coal car. "All right, boys. The gentleman wants a look at you." Brock Silas's eyes went to the gondola, and his face hardened. At Houston's shout, 10 men raised up behind the steel breastworks of the gondola, and 10 hard-bitten faces looked over its edge. Every man in the car was looking at Brock Silas from behind the sights of a Winchester rifle, and each of the 10 rifles was aimed directly at Brock Silas's heart. "Now," Houston said softly, "now that we understand each other, you can turn your dogs loose when it suits you." He turned his back on Silas and said, "All right, boys, go on with your unloading." Houston kept his back to Silas long enough to see his men start moving back on the job, and long enough to give Silas time to let the deadlock sink into his mind. Then he turned back to the man and watched him. He saw the shock still paralyzing Silas's handsome face, which had registered the strength of his urge to dominate. Houston suspected that the man had gotten away with a great deal in his lifetime by the use of his own dominating appearance and manner, and perhaps had never been seriously challenged. Now, stopped cold by a contemptuous defiance in the presence of his own men, he was stunned, for he had not expected any such occurrence. He could only stare at Houston without speaking. The men behind Silas saw there had been a hitch in his plans, and Maddox Shaw pushed his horse up alongside Silas. He looked at the row of guns in the coal car, and then at Silas. "How about it?" he asked. "Do we stop 'em or don't we?" Still Silas didn't answer, and Houston smiled coldly at Maddox Shaw. "He hasn't yet decided whether he's ready to die now or not. Give him a minute to make up his mind." Before Houston's eyes, Silas became a changed man. Some of the bluster went out of him, and it would never again be used against a man who might possibly call his hand. The dominating bully boy died, but a more dangerous man was born, a man who would use his good brain, guile, and even cruelty to gain his ends. Brock Silas was a man of insatiable ambition, and that ambition did not die with the death of the blusterer. It lived and grew stronger in the man who had risen from the ashes of his humiliation. Brock Silas turned and rode back towards town without a word. The puzzled men behind him saw their leader back down before their eyes, and turned to follow him with an attitude of contempt. They would soon change this. Bob Burnham came up and joined Houston, who was standing in the dust, and they both watched until Silas and his men turned out of sight around the corner. Burnham shook his head wonderingly. "Where did you get those gun hands?" he asked, watching the men crawl out of the gondola. "Went over to Kiowa and hired him yesterday." "Why didn't you say something about it? And have it leak out so Silas could get set for him?" "I wanted it to surprise him and throw him off balance. It worked. I never expected to live to see him back down from a bluff he had made." "Did you ever see anybody try to hack him down before?" "Come to think of it, no. The trouble with him was that he was a creature of habit. He expected people to run before him, so he wasn't prepared to act when one man failed to do it." "Well, anyway," Burnham said, wiping his head with a bandana, "I'm sure glad we whipped him so easily." "We didn't," Houston replied. "We've just made him more dangerous." "How come?" "He's a man of too much pride. We made a fool out of him, and he's not a man who can stand that. He'll brood over it, it'll eat at his vitals and poison him inside, because it has shown him that he is afraid. I don't think he knew that before. But he knows it now, and knowing it, he will have to act differently. His pride will demand that he destroy me, and his fear will make him do it in an underhand way. No, Bob, he's not whipped. He's a more dangerous man now than he was when he rode up here." Chapter 3. A spring dusk had fallen over Houston's ranch, bringing cooling breezes down from the hills. There had been no further effort to stop the unloading, and now the barbed wire spools lay in groups of 3 every quarter of a mile along the roadway in front of the ranch. Houston and his crew had cut wood posts all winter, and they had long since been strung out and set every 3 paces across the front of his property. His 10 imported gun hands had joined his own 5 riders in the bunkhouse, and now smoke curled upwards from the chimney of the cook stove, drifting lazily away. It was a picture that had always brought peace and relaxation to Houston, but now the quiet stillness had a different effect on him. It was ominous, filled with tension, as though the very air itself were poised, waiting for something to explode. A curl of dust pinpointed itself on the road to the west, and moved slowly toward him. After a while, Bob Burnham rode up and dismounted. He and Houston walked over to the porch and sat down. The old man wiped his red forehead with a bandana before speaking. "Guinea's on the warpath," he said abruptly. "Brock's got to her and convinced her that barbed wire means bloodshed. She says she won't fence unless the whole range gets together and agrees to it. Brock told her he'd be willing for fences to come if the majority says it's all right. Meaning he's got the majority behind him in trying to keep the wire out. Sure, he knows what he's doing, but he's got her convinced that it's not him that's making the trouble. I can't understand how a girl with as much sense as she has could fall for the line that hombre puts over on her. She's as blind as a bat when he starts talking." "Blinded by his brilliance," Houston speculated. "She always admired ambition. Anyway, when she agreed to go along with the majority, Brock sent his riders to round up all the ranchers for a meeting at her house tonight. She told me to tell you. Coming?" Houston said, "Sure, but you know the answer already. Everybody not on the creek bottom will be against us, and that's Silas's majority." "I know, but what are we going to do if the majority says the range stays open?" "I'm going to fence, just like I started to do." Burnham shook his head. "I knew you would." He got up and looked off across the grass. "Of course Guinea's calling us off, so that's that as far as we're concerned. I mean, as a crew. But you know how I feel personally." "I know," Houston agreed. "I hate to lose you, but I know how it is." "Nothing personal, Bob." Burnham kicked the dirt with a gesture of impatience. "Damn it, Cody. A man's got a right to fence his property if he wants to, and Brock knows that as well as anybody. He's starting a war for the benefit of his own pocketbook and pride, and somebody's going to get hurt. Ginny ought to be squared away with you, instead of letting Brock make a monkey out of her. I feel like a skunk." I don't know what's happened to the girl's brains. Forget it, Houston said. She'll learn. Maybe. And maybe it'll be too late. Coming. I think I'll ride over to Church's first. I'd like to talk with old Amos. I'm going to need all the help I can get. I'll be along later. The church place lay across the creek south of Houston's Circle W, and Houston crossed the creek, taking the trail up to the old man's house. At the edge of the woods, after crossing the creek, he caught sight of a mounted figure spurring toward him, and although he wasn't sure, he was under the impression that he saw a second horseman fade into the woods. The light was bad, but he thought the man who disappeared so quickly was Hugh Anson, a small rancher with a place a few miles up the creek on the same side as the church spread. He reined up as the approaching figure waved at him, and Enid Church rode up beside him. "Howdy, neighbor," she greeted him. "You sure have been keeping yourself scarce around these parts lately. I was tempted to steal one of your calves, just so you'd come over here looking for it. How goes?" The girl's voice was casual and bantering, and Houston turned it over in his mind, weighing her words. They were too casual. She sat her horse young and straight as an Indian, and there was a black sheen to her hair, and an ivory undertone to her transparent skin that no amount of sun could roughen. Her eyes were misty, with shining crosses in them like those in a star sapphire, except that their pupils were black like the iris's, and you could not see deeply into them. She was casual, but she was alert and on guard, and her banter was that of a person talking to buy time, to form judgments under the cover of her words. Houston saw this and wondered about the man she had just left. He, as she had done, said the usual things. "Just thought I'd drop by and see your dad," he said easily. "How is he, anyway?" The girl's smile was peculiar. "Have you forgotten that you saw him in town yesterday? He's about the same as he was then, thanks." She was mocking him, reading his mind and letting him know he was not fooling her. She was always that way, deep and shrewd, saying things 2 or 3 moves ahead of where his mind was working. She was lovely, and to him she had always been a mixture of elusiveness and an almost open invitation to explore the innermost recesses of her strange heart. He often felt a strong longing for her, mixed with a distrust of her agile mind, which puzzled him. He had just about concluded he was the kind of man who didn't like girls who were very smart. And the way she was acting now, he knew she had guessed his errand and was mocking him for trying to hide it. He saw that though she was toying with his words, she was studying him even more carefully than when she first came up beside him. He did not intend to let her worm his business out of him. She was too good at that sort of thing. "I wanted to see him on business," he said shortly. "Yes, I know," she answered sweetly. "He's mighty popular right now. More business than he's had in 10 years. Houston arched his eyebrows and offered no comment, but his expression was a question. This girl liked to entangle people in their own words too well. Let her do the talking. She waited for him to question her, and when he didn't, she said with a touch of annoyance, "Yes, everybody's wooing him now. Even Brock Silas. That's what you wanted to know, wasn't it?" Houston had to smile a little. "All right, Enid, let's cut out the fighting. You probably know all about it anyway. Where's Amos?" Enid slapped the ends of her reins on her saddle thoughtfully. "All right, you big ox. I've practically thrown myself into your arms a dozen times, and you sat me down like I was still a child. You never did know that I had grown up. But now you want my friendship. Want to make a deal for it. I'm afraid I haven't got anything that would interest you." "Stop beating around the bush," she said impatiently. "You have, and you know it. All right, you saw me with Hugh Anson a minute ago, and you know what Pop thinks of Hugh. He might misunderstand things, so what'll you take to keep your big mouth shut about seeing us together?" "So?" Houston smiled. "You're a big girl now. Well, the secret is yours. I won't beat you over the head with it, so forget I saw it. Now, where's your dad?" He was down on McGee Creek Meadow all day and was supposed to be home by now. Brock Silas came by a couple of hours ago, and I told him where Pop was, so he rode out to meet him. They'll probably all be in for supper. If you and Brock can keep from shooting it out across the table, then come on up and help us wreck a new leg of venison that's in the oven. Who was with Silas? 2 or 3 of his boys. I don't remember. You won't let them keep you from having your visit, will you? She was mocking him again, knowing as she must that trouble was brewing. Why should I? Well, she answered speculatively, I thought maybe you were one of those who wouldn't do anything to provoke trouble. Did you think I would run from it? You seem to have been running from me when I tried to marry you, didn't you? I thought you figured I was trouble. I didn't know you had tried to marry me. Don't tell me you're that dumb, Cody, the girl laughed, but there was a peculiar quality to her laugh despite its banter. Anyway, it's your funeral. Let's ride. Chapter 4. Amos Church was an old-timer in these parts. His house was low, long, and sturdy, much like he'd been. Now he was stooped and tired, his hair white, clothes hanging loosely, but he still had that seasoned look like the hewn oak beams in his big living room. Years ago, he'd taken his land and fought to hold it, building walls and acres around him. Now only his daughter, born late in his life, kept his interest. He'd never feared a man and had killed more than one, yet he'd never wronged even his worst enemy. When Houston came in after leaving Enid in the hall, he saw Amos sitting at his desk in the living room corner. With him were Brock Silas, Maddox Shaw, and another of Silas's men whose name he didn't know. Church said, "Howdy, Cody. Take a seat." His greeting was neither distant nor warm, leaving his sympathies unclear as he weighed the appeal of 2 factions, each tallying their allies. Church had seen range wars, even fought in them, but he was weary now and wanted only peace. Houston's eyes turned to Silas, reading him for a favorable answer. Judging there wasn't one, he glanced at Maddox Shaw, who licked a freshly rolled cigarette and smirked, as if sharing a private joke. Out of respect, Houston had left his gun on his saddle. Silas and his men had ignored such courtesy, still armed, and Maddox Shaw clearly noted it. This setup was different from when Maddox had been caught unarmed in town, and he made sure Houston knew it. Houston sat in a rawhide chair, pulling out the makings. Silas turned, sizing him up. Seeing Houston unarmed, Silas came to a decision, nodding stiffly. He then turned to Amos, ignoring Houston. Amos, I've told you the whole story. It's open range or fences, which means no range at all. You carved out a home without fences. Do you want to see this country cut into little fields, with no water for stock, no grazing room? Fences mean dead cattle, buzzards on their carcasses. Is that what you worked for? Your neighbors trust you. If you say no fences, they'll support you. If you permit it, there'll be bloodshed. It's a responsibility, Amos, but we need you tonight to take a stand. Your voice will mean peace. If you stay silent, remember the bloodshed that could follow. Houston sat, bleak-eyed, cigarette dangling. He pictured Silas and Amos side by side. Though both were of similar height, Church's age had slimmed him down and hunched his shoulders, while Silas, still young and energetic, filled his clothes. But even seated, Amos seemed to tower over Silas, not physically, but morally. Silas had argued for his cause, yet his words sounded hollow to Houston. Amos's silence held more weight than Silas's entire plea. Finally, Amos spoke, his words slow and deliberate, carrying a finality Silas couldn't ignore. I've thought about what you said, Church replied. I've fought men who tried to fence public land. I own land, and I won't fence it. But if I wanted to, no man could stop me. Whether Houston fences his land is none of my business, but he has the right to, and I won't stop him. I won't take sides. That's my answer. He turned, opening a desk drawer and shuffling papers, signaling he'd spoken his last on the matter. Brock Silas stood, fingers hooked in his belt, pacing as he controlled his impatience. He was wise enough to see Church's will was unbreakable. Angered but cautious, Silas avoided an open conflict with Amos, playing a smarter game than before. "All right, sir, if that's your decision. I'm disappointed, and I don't think it will help keep peace when Houston starts his war. But I respect your judgment." He turned to Maddox Shaw. "All right, boys, let's go." Houston got up, extinguishing his cigarette in the fireplace. "I guess, Amos, you've answered me as well as Silas, so I'll be going too." Church said, "Wait, Cody. I'd like to see you. I have some business with you." Maddox Shaw's amused gaze locked on Houston, a cold smile spreading on his lips. The cat had cornered the rat. He stepped in front of Houston. "I've got some unfinished business with you too, haven't I, Houston?" "Have you?" "About Pecan Creek." He saw a bleak veil flash across the big man's eyes before his usual smile returned. "No. About you interfering in my personal affairs this morning. You see, I was having my word questioned, and you didn't give me the chance to get satisfaction for that insult. I'll have to get it now while I can." His massive hand formed a fist, and he hit Houston across the jaw before Houston could react. Houston flew halfway across the room, crashed into the fireplace, and slipped to the floor. He scrambled to his feet and took 3 steps toward Shaw. The unnamed rider stuck his foot out, tripping him, and Houston sprawled face down at Shaw's feet. Shaw hauled off and kicked him in the ribs, using all his strength and knocking the wind out of him. Houston gasped for breath, rolled out of Shaw's reach, and got up again. Shaw came after him, and Houston, still breathless, grappled Shaw, boring his head into Shaw's chest until he could get his lungs working again. Shaw, however, was determined to keep him off balance and aimed to finish him quickly. He tried to shake Houston loose for a clean punch, but Houston held on until he got his breathing under control. Shaw started delivering sharp, rabbit punches to the back of Houston's neck, trying to weaken him. Suddenly, Houston let go and stepped back to swing, but the other rider drew his gun and struck him on the back of the head. Houston didn't see the blow coming and sank to the floor, fighting to regain his senses. The rider was jumping with excitement. "There he is, Maddox, finish him." Maddox was stepping in to do just that when Church's voice cut through the room. Old Amos Church had his massive Beasley Colt aimed at Shaw, the muzzle like a cannon barrel. "Stand back, young man," he ordered. "The next man who lays a hand on him, I'll put a hole through." Shaw looked at the gun, then at the old man's face, and read the answer there. He backed away, keeping his hands away from his own gun. The rider, too, cooled off when he saw the weapon. Brock Silas, who had been standing aside, letting his men handle it, casually rolled a cigarette as he waited to see what would happen. Church's steady hand on his gun and his quiet resolve filled the room. Seated, he commanded more authority than any man standing. He turned to Silas, not to Shaw or the rider. "Silas," he said with quiet firmness, "I invited you into my home, but these rowdies of yours are only here on your account. Their behavior has been disgruntled. I overlooked the insult of you all keeping your guns on, but I didn't expect you to use them in another man's house. I hold you responsible, and I'm going to have to ask all 3 of you to leave and not return. Good night." Silas's fingers snapped as he searched for words to soothe the old man. "But you don't understand, Amos," Houston gave Shaw cause. "I understand it happened in my house. That's enough. Good night." Church's tone left no room for argument. Silas, visibly frustrated but composed, nodded and gestured to his men to follow. As they passed, Maddox gave Houston a narrow smile. "Seems someone's always spoiling our party, don't it?" he sneered. "Maybe next time." "Maybe up at Pecan Creek," Houston replied coolly. Shaw's eyes tightened, his smile faltering, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah. I like that area. Always brings me luck." He left with Silas and the rider. Houston was left alone with old Amos Church. The girl must have been just outside, for she entered the room now, rushing to Houston when she saw his injuries. It's nothing, he assured her, but she insisted on cleaning the scalp wound from the pistol. Her hands moved with a tenderness that hinted at something personal, reserved especially for him. When she finished, he picked up his hat. "I'm sorry for causing trouble here," he said, looking from her to Church. "I brought it on myself." "You didn't," Church assured him. "A man's welcome in my home, if he conducts himself like one. You were attacked, and you had every right to defend yourself." The old man scratched his chin, looking weary. "I know what all this means, and it's not good. My work is done, and all I want is peace. I'm not taking sides in this. You're welcome here as always, but so are my other friends, even those against you. No one will enter my home armed again, though. I suppose that covers what you wanted to see me about." Houston nodded, putting on his hat. "Yes, it does. Thanks for the help. They would have gotten rough." "You'd best watch out for that liver-lipped fellow," Church warned. "He fights for sport. You'll cross paths again." "Will you stay for supper?" Enid asked. She had changed into a soft gray dress that hinted she was no longer a child, but a young woman with depth, her eyes holding a look that spoke of her growth. "Thanks, but not this time," Houston answered. "I've more writing to do." "You're headed to Ginny Sterling's?" she asked, but the look in her eyes vanished before he could read it. "I didn't know she was back in town," he replied, glancing at the old man. "Yes, she's home from St. Louis." Houston decided not to mention he'd already been asked about her brother earlier. "I'll see her," he said. "Keep watch, Mr. Church, for the sort who'd spoil your peace." "Thank you," Church said. "You're a good man, Houston." Enid placed a hand on his arm, her gaze sincere. "You have a good heart. I can see it. That's a fine thing to know." He looked at her, struck by her openness. For the first time, he felt the warmth between them, something inviting yet fraught with unknown paths. He backed away, tipping his hat. "I'll see you later, Miss Church." And then he was gone. The moonlight gave her sleek black hair a shine and lent a luminescent quality to her ivory skin. "Isn't it beautiful here?" she asked. "I think this is the most beautiful spot in the world when the moon shines on it. Don't you?" Her voice was soft as a breeze, and it set his imagination spinning. She was very close now. He could see the flurry of emotion on her face, the tiny tip of her tongue touch her lips. When she looked at him, there was a boldness for a fraction of a minute before she dropped her gaze. He could hear her deep, uneven breathing, then silence as she waited for him to respond. He took a deep breath, then said with forced lightness, "You'd better get indoors. Moonlight is a dangerous weapon to handle carelessly." Then he was gone. She stood on the porch, watching him fade into the shadows toward his horse. When she heard the hoofbeats, she stared into the darkness, wondering. She had set a trap for him. It had nearly drawn him in, she believed. But at the last moment, he'd shied away. She wondered why, and could only think of Ginny Sterling. She turned and went inside, heading to her room. In front of the mirror, she searched her reflection, finding no flaw, and puzzled. Finally, she muttered, "He'll still be around if Silas doesn't kill him." Then she went downstairs to supper. Houston started home, but nearing the woods by the creek, some instinct warned him against his usual trail. He halted, then turned right, heading upstream toward Hugh Anson's place. Later, he could cross the creek near Anson's and reach the Sterling place just as quickly. This caution was only necessary because of Brock Silas's canny reasoning. When Silas's party had taken that trail earlier, Shaw had pulled up beside him and suggested something. "See that patch of moonlight on the trail?" Shaw said. If a man hid in that brush, he could pick off a rider just as he hit that light patch. He wouldn't know what hit him, and he wouldn't bother nobody no more. Silas thought this over, then replied, "That'd be the dumbest thing a man could do. Maybe he wouldn't be bothered by that party, but he'd sure be bothered by others." "I don't get you." "We just had trouble at Church's, didn't we? We leave a few minutes ahead of Houston, and the next day he turns up dead with a bullet in his back. So, does that prove who did it?" Since when have bullets got their owners' names on 'em? Your name would be on that bullet, and church would be the one to read it. Silas shook his head. Maddox, you can't see things like moral force. One man's word is as good as another's to a jury. There you're as wrong as a man can be. One man's word may be equal in law, but not in people's minds. No man in this region has a word as good as church is in his neighbor's eyes. They trust his word against 50 like you. You can't understand that, Maddox, and you never will. That kind of talk is Greek to me, Maddox grumbled. I don't understand it, and I don't believe things I can't understand. You can understand that I'm not letting you ambush Houston now. When you're fighting for your position on a range, you've got to keep your nose clean. Just hold your horses and we'll get Houston in due time without trouble from men with touchy morals. I'm going to Sterling's. You ride into town and check the saloons. See if Houston's gun hands are hanging around, maybe looking for higher wages. See if you know any of them or anybody they know. Come up to the house when you're back and tell me what you learn. Maddox Shaw and the other hand rode to town, while Brock Silas continued to Ginny Sterling's. Houston's trail was not trapped. Houston rode past his trail, heading to Anson's, trying to recall what he knew about the man. Not much. Anson had taken up a section across Pecan Creek behind Sterling's place 3 years ago, driven in a few grade cattle and 2 decent bulls, turned them loose and built his quarters. He didn't socialize much, and few people knew him. Anson showed up at roundup in spring and fall, did his share, took his cut, branded his calves, and drove his stock back. He was a big man, easy to work with, but didn't have much land or stock. Just a small timer people saw around, but didn't know well. Houston stopped his horse in a clearing when he saw a light in Anson's cabin, and called out the man's name. Anson blew out his light, came to the door, and shouted, "Who is it?" Houston noted the man's caution. "Houston. Wanted to have a talk with you." The man stepped into the moonlight, and Houston saw he was armed. "Light," the man said, and Houston dismounted to meet him. He had never visited before, and had rarely seen him except twice a year at roundup, with the occasional glimpse along the creek. The man didn't make small talk, waiting for Houston to state his business. "There's a meeting over at Sterling's tonight. I was headed that way, and stopped to see if you were going." "Hadn't figured on it," the man answered. He wasn't cold, just letting Houston do all the talking. "Heard about it?" "Yes." "Then you know it's about fencing. Brock Silas and some of those off the creek are against it. Those of us on the creek keep feeding their stock unless we fence. They claim fencing will ruin them. I claim leaving our land open will ruin us. You're on the creek. I was hoping you'd see things my way, since it affects you as much as me." "Yeah," Anson said. "I've heard the other side too. I haven't made up my mind. Silas has made me an offer." "What's yours?" Anson was as big as Houston, maybe 10 years older. Broad-shouldered, not too big through the middle, his face smooth and healthy with bold gray eyes. He carried himself confidently, trying to take the initiative now. Houston studied him after this revealing question. He hadn't thought Anson would sell his gun to a neighbor, but here he was, dickering in the face of brewing trouble that was as much his as Houston's. Houston turned it over in his mind, then asked, "What's your terms?" "I'm hemmed in," Anson said, "with church in front, the mountains behind, and you folks across the creek blocking the road. You run 2 sections deep between the creek and the road. I want 2 sections from you and 2 from Sterling. That'd give me a 4-section block between you and Sterling, and put me on the road." Houston let the reins slip. "You wouldn't also want my ranch house and Sterling's, would you? This fight is yours as much as ours." The man shrugged. "Could be. But I might not have to fight it. I know the setup, and you don't have enough men backing you. Silas has the strength, and if I make a deal with him, I can keep my place open and gain something after the dust settles. If Silas wins, he'll win, and when he does, I'll get mine. I didn't come here to stay a small timer. You won't grow working for Silas. He thinks that too, but he doesn't know me any more than you do. Get this, Houston, I'm little now, but I won't stay that way. I know Silas's weakness and how to profit from it. I'm a lone wolf, and I side with whoever benefits me most. If Silas thinks he's playing me, he's in for a lesson. You offer nothing. Silas offers part of your land when he drives you off, but he doesn't plan to keep that promise. That only makes me laugh. I'll get mine out of this fight. Don't count me out of it. You may have made Silas back down, but I'm not Silas. I know what gunpowder smells like from both ends of the barrel. Thanks for the warning, Anson. Want to smell some now? I sniff powder when it suits me, and only when there are blue chips lying on the barrel head. Houston mounted his horse. All right. We know where we stand. Just one more thing, keep away from Enid Church. The man bristled. Houston could hear it in his voice. What's she to you? Nothing. But her father is something to me, and to every decent man within a day's ride, if that means anything to you. He turned his horse and rode with his back to Anson, until he disappeared into the woods. As he traveled through the woods and crossed the creek at the ford behind Sterling's, his thoughts turned to what Anson had revealed about himself. Anson had suddenly become a force to be reckoned with. Here was a man with too much ego and ambition, resenting bigger folks who'd ignored him. His bitterness was so strong it had revealed itself at the first chance, to the very people from whom he should have hidden it. Here was a vulture showing his intent to feed on his fallen neighbors. He would bear close watching. Chapter 5. Houston rode up to the sprawling Sterling ranch house, circling it in the moonlight, until he reached the hitching rail in front. He was surprised to find no saddle horses tied there. If the meeting were in progress, the rail would have been full. As he dismounted, he noticed fresh trampled earth, a sign that riders had been there and gone. He tied his horse, went to the door, and knocked. Ginny Sterling opened it, wearing a new green dress, which must have been a recent purchase from her visit. The green made her auburn hair look even redder. She was small but not fragile, with a clean, healthy look about her. Her slightly freckled face had a well-scrubbed, real beauty. There was no mystery about Ginny Sterling, except perhaps how one small girl could possess so much fire and common sense. She held the door open as Houston entered, her eyes flashing. She slammed the door behind him, following him into the big living room where old Bob Burnham sat smoking his pipe. Bob, who had always lived with the family, blew out smoke and winked at Houston. The girl folded her arms and said sharply, "Well, it's about time you showed up. You've lit a fuse to a box of dynamite that'll blow up the whole range, and then you ride off to look at the moon with Enid Church, not caring who gets killed. Cody Houston, you ought to be ridden out of here on a rail." Houston had been playing, arguing, and sparring with Ginny since they were kids, and he didn't take her anger too seriously. He smiled at her. "Hold it, honey. Where's the meeting?" "The meeting's all over, and don't you honey me, you troublemaker." Houston saw her anger ran deeper than her usual quick flares. He looked to Bob, who shrugged and tamped down his pipe, leaving Cody to face Ginny alone. And what did they decide? Just what Brock predicted. It'd be unfair to fence the neighbors away from the creek. "So we're not fencing." "You're not." She looked at him, startled. "You mean you're going to fence anyway, despite what all the neighbors say?" "Despite what the folks who want my grass say. I'm fencing mine, and you ought to do the same, unless you're ready to quit ranching." "Cody, you're crazy. You're begging for trouble. I don't see how a head as thick as yours can have so little sense as to make you start a war." "I'm not starting it. Silas intends to start it if I fence my land." "That's different." "It's not. It's all the same. It means killing." Houston gave up trying to convince her. He shrugged. "Do what you want," he said. "I'll take your wire if you feel I've double-crossed you. I can use it. I don't want money for the wire. I just don't want you being a fool." Old Bob put down his pipe on the side table. "I've been listening to you two quarrel and fight for nearly 20 years, he complained. "Why don't you settle it once for all? Kiss and make up, why don't you?" Ginny looked at Houston with biting scorn. "Kiss that idiot? I'd just as soon kiss a cactus. Good night." She turned to leave the room, but suddenly Cody caught her wrists, holding her facing him, watching the fire in her eyes. A new impulse swept through him. He watched her face as a look of surprise, then wonder crossed it. She stood still, her face lifted to his, her lips motionless as though she were facing something new. He heard a catch in her breath, saw the quick rise and fall of her chest. Then he drew her to him, locking her in his arms. He bent his head and kissed her. Her mouth was firm for a moment, but then the firmness gave way under his urgency, and her arms went around his back. For a brief moment, he felt the softness of her, and then it was over. She pulled back, staring at him as if she'd never seen him before. She turned and ran out of the room without a backward glance, and he stood, listening to the tap of her heels as she ran up the stairs. Houston was shaken. He wanted to get outside into the dark, alone, to think about what had happened. He picked up his hat from the table and strode out into the moonlight, heading for his horse. Bob caught up with him before he could untie the reins from the rail. The old foreman tactfully ignored the unsettling event, talking about other matters. "How'd you make out with Amos?" he asked. "No good. He's going to sit tight on the sidelines, and you can't blame him at his age. Looks like I'll be riding alone in this. I even tackled Anson." "Anson should have come in with you," Bob said. "He's got bottomland grass he should want to protect." "That's not his main idea," Houston replied. Then he told Burnham about his conversation with the man from across the creek. "So," he said when he'd finished, "looks like we've got an interesting new neighbor." "You don't say," old Bob said thoughtfully. He filled his pipe and lit it while deep in thought. "You know, that might tie in with something Ginny said at supper. I didn't pay it any mind at the time, because I had other business on my mind. Ginny's aunt told her that Hugh Anson is well known over at Deer Lick. She said he has a ranch near there, and is understood to have another big ranch here. They say he drives a lot of his stock from this ranch to Deer Lick to fatten before shipping. Way I get it, folks think this is his main ranch and the Deer Lick place is just a subsidiary. Funny, ain't it?" Houston turned this information over in his mind, fitting it into what he knew about Anson. When he'd put it all together, he said, "He hasn't enough stock here to supply any feeder lot in Deer Lick. And his stock shows the usual increase every roundup, which wouldn't be the case if he was driving it out. So, where's he getting all this stock he's sending to Deer Lick?" "Only one thing he could be doing," Bob said. "Branding sleepers. Plenty of men started that way, and it'd be easy here with this wooded creek bottom and the hills. A man could comb these woods daily with a running iron, and have little chance of being caught branding a calf and shifting it over to his side of the creek." "Yeah," Houston agreed. "And as long as he wasn't too greedy so our herds didn't show too small an increase, and as long as he had another ranch over the mountains to drive them to, no one would suspect him." "That must be the answer then," Bob reckoned. "But it's only a suspicion. All you've got is him flying off the handle and showing his colors." "We've got enough to go on," Houston said. "If he's stocking another ranch and claiming it's from here, then he's lying. And he's not buying stock here, he's getting it from somewhere. Our stock is right under his nose. Now we know where he stands. What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing until I catch him in something crooked. I've got my hands full." "You have that, all right. Know where you stand?" "Exactly. I'm standing alone, with 5 riding hands I can trust, and 10 hired gunmen who'll stay as long as they're paid. Against me are Brock Silas and about 20 gun hands, along with all the ranchers who want to live off our grass. Then there's Maddox Shaw, who's backing Silas for reasons I don't know, and who's a backshooter with a grudge against me for what he suspects I know about him. Cue Anson too, if he can gain from my trouble. And Ginny, the old man asked. You figured her against you before. She doesn't count. She's just an obstinate kid with the wrong idea. She might have been a kid before, but she stopped being one about 10 minutes ago, the old foreman said sagely. What do you mean? Houston asked, feeling a stir of confusion. Don't be a fool, Cody. The old man tapped his pipe on his boot. So, he said, changing the subject. What's your plan? Wait for the pack to bear down on you. No, I can't get help, so I'm doing it alone. I'm starting now with Maddox Shaw. Why Maddox? He's just a little fish. You think so? I think he's a keystone. If I can pry him loose, I believe I can break up the combination against me and handle them separately. Got anything on him? Cody Houston pondered this, then decided. Did it ever occur to you that Guinea's dad was murdered? Old Bob was silent, then said, Cody, how can you figure that? We were all deer hunting together. You, me, and Brock Silas were in sight of each other when we heard the shot. A-Flat was barely 500 yards from us when his gun went off. We thought his gun went off. When we reached him, he was by the barbed wire fence, unconscious, with a fired shell in his gun. Anyone would naturally think he accidentally shot himself trying to get through the fence with a loaded gun, since so many people are shot that way. Naturally. But why think differently about Ab's case? I never imagined you suspected Brock of killing him. I don't suspect Brock fired the shot. I was practically in sight of him when it happened, so he couldn't have. I've suspected it for a while, but I couldn't figure out a motive. Now I can, and I'm going to act on it. I think Maddox Shaw shot A-Flat Sterling. How do you figure that? Remember, we took A-Flat back to camp and sent for a doctor. I helped the doctor remove the bullet. A-Flat was carrying a Winchester rifle. But the bullet wasn't a Winchester steel-jacketed bullet. It was a big lead slug, likely from an old Krag. It couldn't have been fired from Ab's gun, so someone else shot him. And I've seen Maddox Shaw hunting deer with an old Krag. So have you. Old Bob Burnham was silent for a moment, then muttered, I remember Maddox saying in town he'd been across the state when the accident happened. He'd likely been hiding, waiting for Silas to set his trap. Then he shot Ab, slipped up, ejected a live shell from Ab's gun, and replaced it with a fired one. He probably did it just as A-Flat started through the fence, making it look like an accident. But why? That, I'm not sure. But remember, it was Brock Silas's idea for us to all go up there deer him ting, when we could have got deer a lot closer home. Cody, Bob Burnham said tensely. If we'd saved that bullet for proof, I'd go with you right now to face Maddox Shaw with it. Cody Houston pulled the bullet out of his pocket and held it in his hand in the moonlight. Here it is. I've saved that bullet for a long time, Bob. Tonight, I'm going to match it with Maddox Shaw's old rifle. Are you going with me? Wait till I saddle up and get my gun, the old man said, and turned his steps towards the corral. You done dragged me into this in spite of what Ginny says. Chapter 6. Maddox Shaw's cabin lay in the hills west of Sterling's, and Houston and Burnham approached it on foot, having tied their horses a safe distance from the clearing. You say Maddox wasn't with Silas at the meeting? Houston repeated. No. He could be here, or he could be somewhere else. If he's not here, I'm going to look for that rifle of his anyway. It might not be right. Who cares about that under these circumstances? Bob snorted. That hombre ain't got no rights, to my way of thinking. I never heard of him making an honest dollar since he's been in these parts. When they reached the clearing, Shaw's cabin was an unlighted dark blob under a big oak tree. He might be there asleep and he might not, Houston said. You take the back door, and I'll take the front. Their precautions proved unnecessary. They entered the doors without hearing sounds of life. Houston kept his gun ready and struck a match with his left hand. Not here, Burnham said. Houston lit the oil lamp on the table, closed the door, and they began searching for Shaw's deer rifle. They found the weapon lying flat on top of a ceiling beam, and Houston took possession of it. They left with the gun and rode a mile in the direction of town before stopping to examine it. The rifle held 4 shells, and the lead bullets matched the one that killed Ginny Sterling's father, which Houston had carried since the old man's death, waiting for proof that his friend had been murdered. "That does it," Bob swore. "The dirty skunk. If I'd known this before, I'd have come up here and killed him myself. Where do you think we'll find him?" "He's not with Silas. He's the kind of hombre that can smell excitement like a blizzard smells carrion, and there's likely to be excitement in town tonight. People are going to be milling around, guessing what's coming next." "Let's go then," the old man snapped, slapping his horse with his reins. "I just want to get one good look at that hombre in front of my sights for about 2 seconds. "Hold up, Bob," Houston said, keeping his pacing animal alongside the old man. "That would spoil the whole business." "How come?" "The quicker he's dead, the better it is for everyone." "No. Why do you reckon he killed A flat and set it up to look like an accident?" "I don't know. But what difference does it make why he done it?" "He done it, didn't he?" "Yes, but I can't think of a reason in the world for him doing it. I've got to find out from him why he killed Ab, and I can't find that out from a dead man." "Why have you got to find that out?" "Because if he didn't have a reason of his own for killing Ab, then he must have done the job for somebody who did have a reason. Doesn't that make sense?" Bob rode in silence, turning this over in his mind for a while before he answered. "That must be the answer. He connects up with somebody else. But how are you going to make him tell you what you want to know? You can't hurt him with less than a sledgehammer on his skull or a bullet in his heart. How are you going to make him talk?" "I don't know," Houston admitted. "I wish I did, but I don't. All I know is I've got to do it, so he's got to stay alive." "Son," Bob said, "you bite off the biggest chews of any young feller I ever knew. One of 'em is going to choke you one of these days." "I'm choking already," Houston said. "I haven't got much more to lose." They speculated on possible connections between the elements that opposed Houston, until they cantered into the darkened town and pulled up at the Elite livery, handing their animals over to Ron Greer. Greer looked at them queerly as Houston cradled Shaw's rifle in his arm and gave orders. "Don't unsaddle them. Just water them and take the bits out of their mouths." Greer twitched his nose nervously. "All right, Cody." The man was bursting with tension, but he remembered how Houston had cut him short that morning when he'd started meddling, so he held his tongue. Bob asked, "Who's in town, Ron?" The question was like puncturing a balloon, and the wind started whistling out. "Silas's men came in earlier and are down at the Parisian, and some of them knew men Cody's is at the Rattlesnake. Ain't nothing happened yet." Houston's face cracked into a cold smile. "Expecting something to happen, Ron? With all them guns lined up agin each other?" Greer answered, surprised. "How could it keep from it?" "That's simple, Ron. If those men are paid gun hands like you say, then they're not going to start throwing lead at each other just for the fun of it on their own time, are they? They'd most likely be satisfied to draw their wages and not have to pop any shells at all, wouldn't they? How would you feel if you were in their boots?" "I never looked at it that way," Greer admitted. "Still and all, folks is kind of worried." As they walked up the darkened street, Bob said, "Everybody in this town is wound up tighter in the spring of a dollar watch. The sound of a 4th of July firecracker going off would bounce half the town out of its beds right this minute." The street was dark, except for a few dim lights in 3 or 4 frame houses, and the lighted windows and bat-wing doors of the 2 saloons. They passed Merle Roberson's store, and Houston stopped. There was a dim light in the office at the rear, and Merle Roberson was working over some papers. Houston reached into his pocket and brought out the lead bullet. "You take this and that rifle of Shaw's and go in and give it to Merle for safekeeping. Tell him everything I've told you up to now." "How come?" Bob asked suspiciously. "I'm going down to the Parisian and see Shaw." "I'm going with you." "No, you're not. There might be some fireworks." "That's why I was going. A man could get hurt in a room full of flying bullets." "That's why you're not going. We both might get hurt, and then who would there be left to see that Maddox got what's coming to him? Merle knows what I suspected, and if he's got the evidence, he could get a bunch of decent people together and handle Maddox, even if we got shot up." "Go on." "That ain't right," Bob argued. "Do you remember that Ginny told you to keep out of this?" Houston asked. "Who'd look after her? And besides, this is personal between me and Maddox. I'm depending on you to get that evidence into Merle's hands safely. See you later." Houston turned abruptly and walked on down toward the Parisian bar, leaving the old man grumbling to himself on the sidewalk. Finally, Bob turned and went into Roberson's. Houston did not let his steps lag, but walked directly down to the Parisian and pushed inward through the swing doors. He stepped inside and slid his back to the wall while his eyes adjusted to the light. The Parisian was a long, low-ceiling place filled with smoke and the smell of stale beer. The floor was littered with cigarette butts, and the tables and chairs were stained dark and in bad repair. The bartender was leaning over the bar, talking to a pair of Silas's gunnies. A few townsmen were scattered about at the bar and tables, and a dozen or more of Silas's men were among them and at the poker tables, all armed. One of the gunnies strolled to the door and disappeared through it. Houston got his eyesight cleared at about the time everybody in the saloon recognized him. He walked to the bar. The buzz in the room died so completely that only the ticking of the big clock and the tap of Houston's boot heels was heard. He stopped at the bar, and his gaze went around the room. He spotted one of his new gun hands sitting at a table drinking with a couple of Silas's men, and he spoke to the man. "What are you doing here, Shote?" he asked. The lean man with one drooping eye grinned back at Houston. "Just run into a couple of old friends of mine." "Why?" "You're not working for me anymore. Ride out in the morning and get your war bag and your pay." The man merely grinned back at him, and Houston turned to the bar. "I'm looking for Maddox Shaw." "He ain't here." The bartender sucked a gold tooth and grinned. "Where is he?" "Did you try the rattlesnake?" There was a hidden taunt in the answer, as though the bartender were gloating over the idea of Maddox Shaw invading the bar that was Houston territory. He said he was going to drop in there for a few drinks. Houston looked around and saw a few smirking faces, and he kept his eyes on them until the smirks faded. Then he turned his back to them and went out and walked down to the Rattlesnake and went in. The Rattlesnake was a larger and much cleaner place, and like the Parisian, it had its quota of townsmen curious enough to be out on a night like this, and a sprinkling of his own paid gun hands. Houston did not like the idea of gun hands, but he had no other recourse in the face of Silas's army. His eyes stopped on Maddox Shaw. Maddox was standing talking to one of Houston's gun hands, his face to the front door, so that he saw Houston when he came in. Here, too, the buzzing stopped when he came in. Houston took his time looking over the crowd, and as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he quickly noted one great difference between this place and the Parisian. Not a man in this place was armed. Doc Tutory, the proprietor, kept a big square of shelving with pigeonholes in it back of the bar, and these pigeonholes were stuffed with guns and holsters. There was a fresh sign written with soap on the back bar mirror, which announced that a customer would have to check his guns before being served. To emphasize the importance of this new ruling, Doc had his sawed-off double-barrel shotgun leaning against the mirror right under the sign. Doc was a quiet man who ran a respectable place, but he ran it and he kept trouble down. Houston's eyes swept through the room and settled back on Maddox Shaw. And then he looked a second time before he could be convinced. Maddox Shaw was not wearing a gun. It seemed incredible to him that Maddox Shaw would come into an enemy stronghold and allow his gun to be taken from him. Houston hitched up his own gun belt and walked down the bar and stopped about 5 feet beyond Maddox. Maddox broke off his conversation with the young Houston gun hand and turned and smiled his thick-lipped, crooked smile at Houston. Then his eyes went down to Houston's gun, and his smile spread into a cold laugh. Houston glanced at his man standing with Shaw and said, "Get away from the bar." The tall young fellow shrugged, picked up his bottle and glass, and found himself a seat at one of the tables. Several townspeople heard and understood and started for the door, making efforts to appear unhurried while they got out as fast as they could. Tutory came down the bar and said, "Howdy, Cody. Check your gun." The question was asked politely, casually, but Houston knew that he was not going to drink in this saloon tonight with his gun on, for the question was also a demand. Houston searched the room with his eyes, and he could see nothing out of the way. But there was something wrong here. He could feel it though he could not see it, and his natural caution held him back from answering Tutory for the moment. There were perhaps a dozen townspeople here, the saddle-maker, the grain and feed man and his brother, and a few others who were, or should have been, neutral in this fight. And there were 7 or 8 of his newly hired gun hands. These men had sold their guns to him, and for a moment he could not understand their allowing themselves to be disarmed in a town full of enemies. Then he had to smile at himself. He had answered this one to Ron Greer only a few minutes before. They had sold their guns to him when he needed them, but they were on their own time now, not working at their trade, and they would know Silas's men wouldn't be looking for a battle either. Both sides were paid to follow their employers when bullets flew, but it didn't make sense for them to look for extra gun work just for fun when there was drinking to be done and a good fistfight brewing. But that didn't explain the laugh on Maddox Shaw's face. The trouble was there. Maddox knew something. He had an angle, and he was savoring the taste of Houston's blood before he'd drawn it. Houston, with his gun on his hip, studied the unarmed Maddox and puzzled over this one. Then his mind tore it apart, revealing Maddox Shaw's cunning. A gunfight between them would be even odds, maybe favoring Houston. But a fistfight? That was something else. Maddox Shaw outweighed Houston by a good 75 pounds, his 250 all bone and muscle. He was built like a wrestler, light from the waist down, with a big torso of thick rawhide muscle. He was a brutal fighter, driven by a cruel urge to maim, to tear a man apart with his bare hands. And he had a streak of animal cunning. Houston realized why Maddox Shaw had taken off his gun. The man who slipped out of the Parisian had brought word of Houston's errand, and Shaw saw a way to get the edge. Houston couldn't start a fight with an unarmed man. He'd either have to remove his gun or back down. And once Houston was unarmed, Shaw's broad, challenging grin promised what he'd do to him. Tutory stood behind the bar, waiting for Houston's decision. He was a stable man, and his saloon wasn't a roughhouse, but he was human too. The town's tension affected everyone, including Tutory. There'd be no gun battle, and since this fight would make history, Tutory decided a little broken furniture was worth it. He'd have a grandstand seat, and the advertising wouldn't hurt either. Tutory waited, patient for Houston's decision. The silence was so intense that a cricket chirped loudly in a dark corner, audible to the whole room. Houston stepped back from the bar, unbuckled his gun belt, and tossed it on the counter. "Set me out a bottle of rye," he ordered. The tension in a dozen men relaxed, and they settled in to enjoy the slaughter. Houston saw the savage anticipation in Shaw's smile, as Tutory took the gun belt and stuffed it into one of the pigeonholes. The big man finished his drink and wiped his mouth with his sleeve, watching Houston pour a glass of whiskey. "Here you are again," Shaw grinned. "Looks like you're following me around." "I am. Missed you out on Pecan Creek and over at the Parisian." "Pecan Creek," Shaw repeated. "You've been saying that a lot lately. What are you hinting at?" "Had you worried, huh? Trying to figure out how much I know about A. Flat Sterling's murder?" "I know it all now. Who hired you? Why? Got the gun you used and the bullet the doc cut out of Ab. It matches your ammunition. It's ready to hang you to a cottonwood. Maddox Shaw laughed, loud and long. One drink and you're seeing things, Houston. A Flat died in a hunting accident. His face went serious, his eyes boring into Houston. What gives you such notions? A Flat died as the result of an accident, all right, but not a hunting accident. He owned land your boss wanted. Walked into a trap, and you sprung it with your old crag. Those guns were always dangerous. Yours'll be the death of you. Shaw's eyes swept the room. You all hear that? He asked. The man says he sneaked around and stole my gun. Tutory's sense of fair play brought caution to his lips, and Houston looked as he spoke. Cody, he's twice your size, he said, reaching for the sawed-off shotgun. Watch him. Houston had expected Shaw's move, and saw Shaw's muscles tense as he sprang forward. Houston's hand slid to the neck of the whiskey bottle. He beer-oned himself, dodging Shaw's clutching arms, and swung the bottle in an overhand arc, crashing it on Shaw's head. Shaw ducked, but the bottle smashed against his matted hair, the jagged end slicing down his forehead, leaving red furrows like tribal marks. The blow jolted Shaw. He turned and clutched the bar to steady himself, shaking his head to clear it. Tutory put Houston's gun behind the bar. Someone yelled, "Finish him quick." One of Houston's gun hands grabbed a chair, but Houston saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. "Keep out of this, everybody," he said, backing up to the old upright piano. Men at the rear tables slid out of their seats, pushing tables against the wall to make room. Houston picked up the round-top piano stool, gripping an ornate leg above the brass claw holding a glass ball. Shaw, recovered from a blow that would have knocked an ordinary man unconscious, came at Houston slower, with steam gone but still dangerous. With the strength of a bull and insensate fury, Shaw cursed as he advanced, ignoring the stool. As Houston swung the stool in a wide arc, Shaw pivoted quickly, ducking so the blow caught his left shoulder and back. The revolving seat of the stool flew out and rolled the length of the room. Houston backed quickly, clutching the stool by two legs, then raised it and brought it down toward Shaw's head. Shaw sidestepped and raised his arm, and the stool caught his hand, knocking his arm to his side with the snap of broken bones. Shaw instinctively rubbed his cracked fist with his other hand, his neck muscles taut. Houston raised the stool again and brought it down. This time it clipped Shaw's face as he moved, landing solidly on his shoulder. Shaw's knees bent as he struggled to keep his stance, giving Houston the chance to slip away from the piano and move into the open. With more room now, he circled Shaw, who turned to face him. Holding the stool with one hand, Houston used sideways sweeps, landing blows that drove Shaw back against the bar. Shaw leaned his elbows on it for support, watching as Houston closed in. Just as he got close, Shaw kicked him in the stomach, sending Houston sprawling under a table. Shaw yelled triumphantly and dashed across the room. Houston rolled, overturning the table as he escaped, then rose behind another table and threw a heavy cracker bowl at Shaw's head. It glanced off Shaw's skull, shattering the mirror behind the bar. Shaw blinked, wiped blood off his face, and glared at Houston, eyes animalistic and lips bloodied. Grabbing a chair, Shaw hurled it at Houston, who sidestepped, then picked up a chair of his own and rounded the table. He smashed it over Shaw, who reflexively raised his hands over his head, hunching his shoulders. The chair splintered in Houston's hands, and Shaw staggered to the wall, bracing himself as Houston closed in. Shaw, regaining composure, flung himself at Houston. Houston met the rush with the broken chair, catching Shaw in the mouth. Shaw wobbled, sank to the floor, then started crawling. Any normal man would have been out cold, but Shaw, with his brute strength, pushed himself to his knees, squinting at Houston through bloody eyes. Houston tossed aside the chair legs. "Now, Shaw, I've got you whittled down to my size. Now we're going to fight." Someone in the crowd muttered, "God Almighty." Shaw dropped his broken hand, glaring through blood-streaked eyebrows. "Yeah, we're going to fight now." He was more animal than man, ignoring his pain as fury fueled him. He came forward, his injured hand raised, right fist cocked. Houston stood his ground as Shaw swung, moving his head to avoid the blow and driving his fist into Shaw's gut. Shaw doubled over, then his head shot up, slamming into Houston's chin. Before Houston could react, Shaw's fist connected with his jaw, pain shooting through him like lightning, leaving him dazed. Sensing his advantage, Shaw stepped back, cocking his arm for another punch. His hook caught Houston on the side of the head, spinning him into the piano. Houston lost his footing and slid down to the floor. Shaw closed in, kicking him in the ribs. Desperate, Houston grabbed Shaw's ankle, pulling himself up. Shaw tried to stomp him, but Houston held on, using Shaw's own leg for support. Rising, Houston felt Shaw's arm wrap around his neck, trying to shove his head back and pound him senseless. Unable to reach Shaw's face, Houston used short, fast punches, targeting Shaw's ribs. Each blow sapped Shaw's breath, and his hold weakened. He staggered back, trying to turn away from the relentless punches. When Shaw backed far enough, Houston cocked his fist and, with every ounce of strength, landed a blow square on Shaw's chin. Shaw fell back, landing in a seated position against the bar. Houston flexed his numb fist, feeling the pain shoot through his shoulder. "Get up, Maddox," he said. "Let's finish this once and for all. Get up and fight." But Shaw sat slumped against the bar, legs sprawled, mumbling through his swollen lips. He made no attempt to rise. His eyes stared into space. Houston spat blood from his mouth. "Get up." Shaw did not move. "Get up," I said. Houston's words snapped like a pistol shot. The sound must have penetrated Shaw's brain, for he shuffled around and used the edge of the bar counter to help himself to his feet. He looked into the remains of the back bar mirror and saw his face bloody from forehead to chin. Blood seeped down from his flattened nose over swollen lips and dripped onto his dingy shirt. His eyes were so swollen that he could hardly see through them. He rubbed his hands across his face in disbelief. The sight of himself must have decided his next action, for he turned and ran toward the front without a glance back at Houston. In his stunned confusion, Shaw did not move toward the door, but straight toward the big plate glass window. He could not have seen the glass, as he did not stop until he bumped into it. He rubbed his hands over it, blindly trying to identify it. Then, in a panic, he picked up a chair, crashed it through the glass, and stepped out onto the sidewalk, starting to run. A chorus of relieved groans filled the room, followed by an awed voice exclaiming, "Good God Almighty!" There was no talk for a long moment, and then Tutory said, "We ought to catch him, Cody, if he killed Sterling." "No. I'm not ready for that yet." Tutory looked puzzled. "But if he killed Ab? I need him to lead me to the man who hired him." "I thought you said you knew who it was." "I did. But I didn't say I could prove it." Doc Tutory grinned. "Sure." Then he added, "All right, boys, line up and name it. It's on the house for the rest of the evening." Houston said, "Lend me a wet bar towel, Doc. Make up a bill for the damage. I'll take care of it." Tutory handed him a towel, and when Houston wiped the blood off his face, Tutory asked, "How about a drink, Cody?" "I haven't got time," Houston answered. "And if Bob Burnham comes in, tell him I'll see him later." He turned to the gun hands lining up at the bar. "You fellows better turn in early tonight," he said. "We're going to start fencing in the morning." Then he turned and left the saloon, went down to the livery stable, got his horse, and rode out of town. As the tightness seeped from him, the pains came. The muscles in his body regained their sensitivity, and with it began the reaction to the terrible punishment they had undergone. His face throbbed, and bruises began to appear. There were places on his ribs that hurt with every jolt of the horse's bounce, and it was a struggle to keep his arms from dropping at his sides. He had taken an awful beating, and it would have been worse if he had depended on his bare fists from the beginning. He speculated on this. No matter how right he may have been, rightness would not have protected him from Shaw's superior strength or brutality. This had not been a boxing match to establish superiority, but part of Houston's design to prove Shaw was a murderer and to drive a wedge between him and the instigator of the murder. Though it was not to his taste, Houston felt justified in using the means he had to whip Shaw into a mental condition where he would make a mistake that could clearly establish the guilt of the man behind him. Even though Shaw had finally run out on the fight, Houston felt somewhat disappointed. He knew Shaw had not been completely whipped, had not revealed anything damaging to himself or anyone else, and was still a dangerous man running loose. Houston could only hope that by planting the idea in Shaw's mind that he knew who the other party was, he had sown discord between them. It was late when he got home, and he did not wake Jess Howard. He went to bed quickly. He had had a long, busy day. He had tried to get help and found he would get none, but he had also learned things and started a brew he hoped would boil up trouble for Brock Silas. As he reviewed the day's events, his mind went to Ginny Sterling, and here it stopped. What had happened between them? He pondered this for a long time, drifting off to sleep with the problem still on his mind. The man who would just as soon marry a wildcat, and the girl who would just as soon kiss a cactus. Chapter 7. When Maddox Shaw escaped from Houston's punishment, he set his horse toward Brock Silas's ranch. He was a battered hulk of a man who had taken enough punishment to have killed 2 or 3 men of normal build, and now the reaction was setting in. His bodily pains were great, but transcending these were the things that festered in his mind, driving him to further action despite the desperate need of his body for rest and healing. Humiliation, rage, and fear boiled up inside him, poisoning whatever judgment he had left. He had been whipped and driven out of town by a man smaller than himself, and this humiliation could never be erased except with Houston's death. His rage at Brock Silas was even greater. He had done a job of murder for Silas, and now interpreted Houston's statement before the fight to mean that Silas had sold him out. He had heard Houston reveal the facts of the murder to townspeople. Knowing their regard for old A. Flat Sterling and the summary justice they would prepare for him, he was terrified of the hangman's noose. These 3 passions drove Maddox Shaw to form his simple plans as he rode. He had to get money from Silas, punish Silas for informing on him, and then go into hiding from the posse he knew would be looking for him. It was midnight when he reached Silas's ranch house and shouted at its darkened walls. When Silas answered his call and he identified himself, Silas lit a lamp and let him in the door. In the littered living room, Brock Silas stood in his pants and undershirt, looked at the beaten Shaw, and instantly saw that something was seriously wrong. He sat down at his desk, pushed a bottle of whiskey across to Shaw and said, "Well, what damned fool trick have you been up to now?" Shaw sat down across from the desk, poured a tin cup half full of liquor and downed it before answering. "I've got to get out of here for a while, and I need some money. I'd better take the whole 1,000 because I might not be back for a while." "What are you talking about?" Silas snapped. "Talk sense. This is sense. The lid's off. The whole town knows now that you hired me to kill Sterling. They'll have a posse after me any time, and I'm not sticking around to stretch a rope for them." "You're a fool," Silas snapped. "How could they know about that deal, unless you told them? Did you get drunk and spout off at the mouth? Who beat you up?" Maddox Shaw picked up the bottle and drank directly from it. "Look here, I ain't got time to beat around the bush with you. Everybody in town knows about it now. Houston went to my place, stole my gun, and he had the bullet they found in Ab. He turned it all over to a committee. He and I had a little set to, and I came off without being able to get my gun back. Now I want the money for that job so I can get out of the country." Brock Silas tapped his tin cup on the desk impatiently while he reviewed this bad news. After a pause he said, "You're just upset now. Thinking you killed A. Flat and proving it are 2 different things. After all, nobody saw you do it, so it's just your word against his." "Don't tell me that," Shaw answered angrily. "It ain't over 6 hours since you told me my word against those people wasn't worth a damn. Now you're saying just the opposite. I ain't staying to find out which is right. I'm pulling out and I want my money, right now, this minute." Well now, Silas stalled. Remember, that wasn't the deal. I told you I'd pay you after I got hold of all that river bottom land. That's a little ways off yet, and in the meantime, I haven't got enough cash to pay you off. Shaw's swollen face went black. You don't think you're going to get out of paying me, do you? He asked sharply. Silas raised a conciliatory hand. Of course not. Take it easy. I'm going to pay you. You're going to pay me now. You're paying those gun hands in cash, and you're going to pay me too. I just can't do that now, Shaw. I simply haven't got the cash to keep those men here long enough to finish the job, and give you 1,000 as well. But I'll give it to you as soon as I get this deal in the bag. You know I wouldn't try to cheat a friend. Sure, Shaw answered. You'd pay somebody to shoot a friend in the back, but you wouldn't cheat the man who did the job for you. It's great to be an honest and respectable man, ain't it, Silas? You're just upset. Let's take another angle for a minute. How did Houston say he knew I was the one who engineered that killing? There was little of Maddox Shaw's eyes showing now under their swelling, but they took on a canny look when he saw that Silas was worried about his own safety. You've been able to figure all the angles, he countered. You figure that one. That's no attitude to take, Silas persisted. Like you say, we're both in this together. If I'm going to have to figure a way to clear us both, I've got to know what we're up against. What did Houston say? How about my money? Shaw countered. Then we'll go into that. He had Silas over a barrel now, and intended to keep him there. About Houston, Silas said. He knows too much. We can't afford to have him around where he can talk out of turn, can we? You owe him for that licking he gave you. Who said he gave me a licking? He's just as bunged up as I am. If he's still alive, I doubt it, Silas said. But it looks like you'd better plan to see that he doesn't do any more talking. So you want me to do another job without paying me for the first one, huh? How about my money, Silas? Silas shook his head. You can't scare me, Maddox. I told you when I'd pay you, and that's when I'm going to do it. Now get on out of here before they come looking for you. Maddox Shaw picked up the whiskey bottle by the neck, put his other hand on the desk, and raised the bottle over his head. Don't be foolish, Silas said. He had lifted a gun from the drawer of his desk, and the muzzle was pointed at Maddox Shaw's face. You know I could kill you and turn you over to that posse you say is forming, and they'd thank me for it. Maddox Shaw let the bottle waver, then took it in his other hand, drank from it, and set it on the table. Some of the self-confidence that Houston had beaten out of him was gone for all time. Maddox Shaw would never be the same man again. That's more like it, Silas purred. Now tell me, what does Houston know for sure about me? I don't know, Shaw admitted. But he knows all right. That's not much help. Silas toyed with the cylinder of his pistol, thoughtfully. Try to use your brains now, Maddox. We've got to work together, not against each other. You know, I just thought of something. Houston might be just guessing. How could he prove what he said? I ain't waiting to find out, Shaw said. I'm going to clear out for a while. Anyway, until my face gets all healed up, I'll come back and get a crack at Houston. I'll get him if it's the last thing I do. If you had just a little money, I'm flat broke and I've got to live till things clear up. That's more like it, Silas smiled. I can give you a couple of $100 on account. You take a little trip till things cool down, then slip back and we'll figure out things. All right. Maybe that's better, Maddox admitted. He picked up the bottle and poured some more liquor into his cup. Silas spun his swivel chair around to face the small iron safe in the corner. He spun the dial back and forth, then swung the iron door open. He unlocked a smaller iron door to a pigeonhole in the safe's interior. Maddox Shaw stood up, gripped the whiskey bottle tightly by the neck, and brought it down on the back of Silas's head. Silas slid out of his seat and lay between the desk and the safe, blood running out of his scalp. Shaw stepped around the desk, found a package of currency in the pigeonhole, riffled through it, and stuffed it into his pocket. Not having stopped to get his pistol when he left the rattlesnake bar through the plate glass window, he picked up Silas's weapon, examined the cylinder, and stuffed it into his waistband. He stood over Silas, looking down at him through his puffed eyes, and said, "I ought to pound your head to a pulp, but I reckon it'd be better if you lived a little longer. Maybe those good people of Ash Fork will be satisfied to see your neck in a noose, since they won't get a chance at mine." He kicked the still form of Silas in the ribs, took another drink from the bottle, and went out to get on his horse. It was some time later when Maddox Shaw pulled up into the clearing of Hugh Anson's house. He shouted until Anson showed up at the door with his pants and gun on, and no light in the house behind him. "What do you want this time of night?" Anson asked irritably. Shaw slid off his horse and said, "Sit down. I had to see you in a hurry." They both sat on the trunk of a felled oak, and Anson waited. Shaw turned his story over in his mind, checking it, then laid it before the taciturn man. "I just had a little go-round with Houston over in town, and I've got to make tracks for a while. I'm going to need a little money to carry me on, and seeing as I done quite a bit of work for you, it ought to be I could get some from you. Say about $1,000. Anson slid off the log, walked a couple of paces, kicked the ground with his boot toe, and turned this over in his mind. He took his time about it, then asked, "How come you have to duck out just on account of a little scrap? Did you kill him?" "No, but he happened to run into something that might not do me no good if he told it around." "Meaning he found the body or something?" "What body? I ain't killed nobody." Anson said, "You're not talking to these fools around here when you're talking to me, Shaw. Did Houston discover that you'd shot A. Flat Sterling?" "Me? Shot A. Flat Sterling? You're crazy." "But that's what Houston discovered, ain't it?" "Well," Shaw admitted, "he figured he had evidence I did, but I didn't do it. Still, there are people that might believe I did." "Like me, for instance," Hugh Anson said softly. "You mean you'd take Houston's word for a charge like that?" "No," Anson said, "but it just happens I saw you kill him." "When?" "I get around, Shaw. I just happened to be interested in what Silas and Houston and Sterling were doing up there at the head of the creek that day, so I kind of kept him in sight. I'm not criticizing you, understand, for killing Sterling. I was just mentioning it so we'd understand each other. Now what was on your mind?" Maddox Shaw told himself that he ought to pull his gun and kill Anson. 3 things held him back. He wanted money from Anson. Anson had a gun and might be able to draw quicker. Something of his old disregard for danger had gone out of him. He felt this new fear and was angry with himself for recognizing it, but he had to face the fact that it had come to him. He could not quite risk facing Anson's gun, and knowing this fear, he had to relinquish the mastery of the situation to Hugh Anson. "All right, you know what you know then," he admitted grudgingly. "So I've got to fade out for a while, and I've got to have money to do it. I've helped you drive enough sleeping beef off this range to have $1,000 worth of help coming from you." Hugh Anson said, "So you decided that you'd blackmail me out of $1,000 before you pulled your stakes. Why didn't you get it from Silas? He don't owe me nothing. Hold him up like you're trying to do me. After all, you shot Sterling for him, didn't you? What makes you think that? Look, my friend, you're just like everybody else on this range. You don't think I've got either eyes or brains in my head. You could take a stick and draw a map of this range on the ground, and you could know the men around here. With those facts, you can tell just what each one of them can be expected to do. I know as much about what Brock Silas is trying to do as he does." "Then why don't you beat him to it?" Maddox Shaw asked. It was dawning on him that he had not given this Anson man credit for nearly as much sense as he should have. Anson chuckled. There's an easier way for a smart man to handle it. Let him go on and furnish the fireworks. He'll do the dirty work and get the blame. Then when he's finished, I'll come along and take over. Simple, ain't it, Maddox? There was a touch of boastfulness in Anson's voice, and also a hint of cordiality that pleased Shaw, in light of his new respect for Anson's brains. You got something there, Shaw admitted. Now about that money, Anson said. I haven't got but a few dollars cash on me, but I've got an idea of how I can help you. That is, if you've got sense enough to recognize a good thing when you see it. I'm going to be top man around here after Silas makes his little play, and I'd have something good for a man with your guts and savvy. Shaw thought this over a moment. If he hadn't killed Silas with that blow to the head, this would be a good way to deal him some more misery. Since he still believed that Silas had sold him out for the purpose of evading payment for his killing job, this appealed to him. He wished he'd realized before that it was Anson who was going to be the big buck around here. What did you have in mind? He asked Anson. I've got about 40 head of short yearlings up in that box canyon that I want driven over to Deer Lick. You've handled as many as 25 at a time. Do you think you could push 40 over the mountains by yourself? The drive would keep you out of sight while your face healed up, and you could hide out at the Deer Lick place till I sent you word that the coast was clear around here. Then you could come back and help me cash in on Silas's work. In the meantime, if Ashfork felt like hanging somebody, they'd take it out on Silas maybe, and save us taking care of him. Anyway, we could clean up anybody that was left that was dangerous to you, and Silas would get the blame for that. How does it sound to you? Maddox Shaw turned this over in his mind for a long moment, and in it he saw the safety he craved, the revenge he wanted visited on Silas, and future prosperity in his lineup with a smarter man than Brock Silas. Sure, he said. It's a deal. But I'd like to get going as quick as I could. I'd like to be on the other side of these mountains by daylight. Wait till I saddle up, Anson said, and I'll help you get the stuff strung out on the trail. You're a smart man, Maddox, and I can make it worth your while to tie up with me. I always did figure you for a smart man yourself, Maddox answered. The kind I like to do business with. He got to his feet, then said, By the way, I reckon I'd better have a fresh horse. Can do, Anson answered and started for his horse. With his face hidden from Shaw, he permitted himself a smile as he thought, Imagine that damned fool coming and throwing me a hole card like that right in my lap too. Well, I'll keep him under cover till I have to use him to knock Mr. Silas off the limb. Then I'm going to have to close his mouth quick. His loose mouth is too dangerous. Chapter 8. Maddox Shaw pushed the stolen 40 head of mixed white faces and pulled Shorthorns up the brushy trail leading over the gap in Ashfork Ridge. In the dark and thick brush, the young stock was easy to control, and he didn't care if a few got away. Sore as he was, Shaw's mood lifted once he and Anson lined out the herd. Fresh ideas kept coming. His pocket held a thick wad of money, though he hadn't counted it, and the 40 head would bring a good price in Deer Lick. This stock wouldn't reach Anson's feeder ranch, it'd go straight to the pens, and Maddox would pocket a nice addition to his roll. He chuckled at Anson, who thought he was smart. Agreeing to Anson's every word, Shaw had even flattered him a bit. And now he had a herd to help him on his way to a place where no one looked for him with a rope. Silas and Anson both thought themselves clever. Maddox Shaw laughed until his cracked lips hurt. At dawn, Shaw reached the cut at the ridge's top where the trail sloped down toward Deer Lick. He halted his horse to let him blow, and surveyed the hillside that stretched down to Deer Lick and freedom. Just then, a voice cut the quiet. All right, Shaw, just hold everything. Shaw froze, then tensed, ready to spur the horse forward, scanning for the speaker. He settled back, heart pounding cold with fear. The voice was Brock Silas's, but hidden from view, leaving Shaw uncertain which way to run or attack. So he sat still as the calves meandered down the trail. The gray dawn's light was faint, and Shaw couldn't see the man he now wished he'd finished off. "What do you want, Silas?" His eyes searched wildly. "Put your hands on the saddle horn, Maddox. Keep them there while we have a talk. Do it." Shaw set his hands on the horn, and the brush rustled as Silas stepped out onto the path, 10 feet ahead, rifle aimed. Silas's head was bare, his hair matted with dried blood. "Just a little talk, Maddox. Just some information I want." "Listen, Silas," Shaw gulped. "I told you I had to get out of the country, and you wouldn't believe me. I needed money, and you wouldn't help. You'd have done the same in my fix, now wouldn't you? I didn't hit you harder than I had to. You won't hold that against me, will you?" "That depends, Maddox. I just wanted a little talk before you left." "How'd you find me?" "That wasn't hard. I figured you wouldn't go home but would need a fresh horse. Anson was the only one out this way you'd try, so I ambled over there. Imagine my surprise, Maddox, seeing you two riding out together. I didn't know you were friends, so I trailed along. And when you two broke this herd out, I just kept following." "You mean gunshot?" "Call it gunshot. Anyway, tell me, Maddox, how long has this been going on?" "I don't know anything about Anson," Shaw said. "I told him I was going over the mountain, and he paid me to drive these calves to his other place." "You don't mean they're stolen?" "Poor Maddox, you'll never grow up, will you? After that whack you gave me, I need answers. How long have you and Anson been rustling sleepers off this creek bottom? Don't tell me you don't know this herd's sleepers. You and I know the bloodlines of my stock, Churches, Sterlings, and Houstons. Want to sell information for your worthless life?" "I don't know a thing, Silas." "Honest." "Honest," Silas mocked, humor rising now with Shaw under his gun. "Honest, I hate to kill you, but if you don't know anything, there's no point in waiting." "Look," Shaw said, sweating as it ran salty down his scratched face. "Don't hold it against me. Sure, I've sold him a few sleepers. I drove maybe 6 little bunches down to his other place." "What place?" "A feeder lot at Deer Lick, under Deer Lick Cattle Company. They think he's a big rancher and cattle buyer there, so they're not surprised when odd brands show up vented and with sales papers. I planned to hide there till things cooled off. Then I was going to get in touch with you." "That's nice, Maddox. But I can't afford you loose. When you get scared, you talk, and that happens often lately. No, Maddox, you're not going to Deer Lick." "Look here," Maddox said, his voice edging toward panic. "Don't rock. I'll do more for you. I'll leave the herd here and go finish Houston off. I'll handle anyone you want. Just don't do anything rash." "Sorry, Maddox. You're not safe. I thought about torturing you, but it's not worth it. Just a job that has to be done." He pulled the trigger, and a spot on Shaw's shirt danced, a puff of dust blooming from it. Shaw made a sound, wobbled, then clutched the horn tighter. But his hands slipped, and he fell as his horse bolted. As Shaw writhed on the ground, Silas leaned his rifle against a tree and knelt. "Where's the money you stole?" Shaw didn't answer, so Silas turned him over, reaching into Shaw's pocket. Hoofbeats sounded. Silas straightened, panic rushing over him. Shaw was still alive and might talk. Measuring the distance to his rifle against the hoofbeats, he saw his own stolen pistol in Shaw's belt. Silas grabbed it and shot Shaw through the head, just as Burnham, Houston, and several others rode up. Waiting for their approach, Silas quickly framed his story. "What happened, Brock?" Merle Roberson asked. "I finally caught up with Maddox," Silas said. "I suspected him of dipping into my herd, so I'd had him working for me to keep an eye on him. He swapped horses, left, and I followed. He was driving a herd of calves he'd been collecting. I waited here to catch him with the goods. Well, we had words and some shooting, and there he is. Did the neighborhood a favor, I'd say." Merle chose his words carefully. "Guess you've saved us a nasty job." "You wanted him?" Silas asked, surprised. "We wanted to ask him about killing A. Flat Sterling. Looks like he did it. Silas clucked. Dirty skunk. That settles him. What'll you do with him? Roberson asked. Far as I'm concerned, he can lie there. Damned if I'll bury him after he stole from me. Houston knelt by Shaw's body. We'll take him down to where we can get tools and bury him, he said, not looking at Silas. I'd like to see what he was driving over the ridge. Silas put the pistol in his belt, grabbed his rifle, and nodded. I'll be going if you boys are taking over. Roberson nodded, studying Shaw's body while Silas went into the woods, mounted his horse, and rode down the hill. Houston examined the wounds on Shaw's head and chest, sharing a significant glance with Bob before rising. We should look around, Houston suggested. Wonder where his horse went. They found it grazing about 100 feet away. Houston approached, patted its nose, and caught the reins. Turning to Bob, he asked, "Recognize this horse?" Not Maddox's, Bob replied. That's his saddle, but the horse belongs to Hugh Anson. It's not his usual mount, but he's used it at roundups. Houston nodded. I remember now. Could be Maddox stole it. Let's check on the stock he was driving. Ron Greer and a few men ventured down the trail past the gap, returning with 30 or so yearlings and calves. They inspected the herd. These calves carried brands from every ranch along the creek, and a few from farther out, Houston noted. All vented to a D and a C. Anyone know that brand? We'll drive them to my place and sort out ownership, Houston suggested. Better load Maddox onto his horse. On impulse, Houston searched Shaw's pockets and pulled out a large roll of cash. Bob whistled as Merle Roberson took and counted it. $2,000, he remarked. I'll keep it in my safe. They tied Shaw's body to his horse, got the calves lined up, and headed back down the mountain. Houston, Burnham, and Merle took up the rear. What's this mean? Merle asked. It's complicated everything, Houston replied. One question leads to another. How so? Asked Bob. It's taken one man out of the picture, but brought another in, said Houston. It leaves us with even more questions. True, Bob agreed. Like why Maddox was on Anson's horse. Could be he stole it. But where'd he get that money? I can answer that, Merle said. It's got the bank's blue band. I cashed a check for Silas with it. If Maddox got it from Silas's safe, he must have stolen it. Then why didn't Silas mention the theft? Maybe he didn't want to claim the money. Or maybe Silas killed Maddox to keep him quiet. Shaw was shot twice, once with a rifle, once with a pistol Silas held. The bullet holes differ. There was a pause between the shots, which suggests Silas wounded him first, maybe to get the money, then shot him again when he heard us coming. I told Shaw I knew who hired him to kill Ab, hoping he'd head straight to them. Looks like he did just that. The money links them, but it doesn't prove Silas hired Shaw for the job. And the horse ties Maddox to Anson, Merle pondered, but not Anson to Silas. We're still unsure if Maddox stole those calves. Every new clue makes this worse. Certainly, it shows there's more trouble on this range than cattle rustling, Houston replied dryly. All I wanted was to fence a piece of land. Now it seems I'll need to fence out more than cattle to keep the peace. They reached a fork in the trail, and Houston pulled up sharply, pointing to the right fork. Look. The calves came from there. That trail leads to the creek ford and onto Anson's place, not from Maddox's as Silas claimed. The men halted, verifying the hoof prints, and discussed the implications. I'll see where that trail goes, Houston decided. You take Maddox's body to my place, get Doc Ellis to check those wounds, and save the bullets if he finds them. Put the stock in my lower corral. I'll catch up after I track this trail down. Chapter 9. Houston had no trouble backtracking the herd of calves. By 9 o'clock, he'd crossed the creek and followed the trail to a corral in a wooded spot on Anson's land, where the calves had been held while their brands healed. Now the corral was empty with its gate open, leaving nothing to link Anson to the stolen cattle, except the tracks leading from the spot. Houston felt sure now that Anson had been in on the rustling with Maddox Shaw, and that Brock Silas, who might have pulled this information from Shaw before shooting him, had used it to divert suspicion from himself. Normally, such evidence would justify Silas's shooting Shaw. But to Houston, it didn't quite add up, especially with Silas failing to mention his missing money. It struck Houston that the missing cash might have been payment to Shaw, either for killing A-flat or for keeping it quiet. He went over the tangled facts again and saw that his guesses made sense but were still only guesses, not enough to confront Silas. As Houston sat on his horse before the empty corral puzzling it out, Hugh Anson rode up. Anson stopped in front of him, waiting for Houston to speak. "How's it going?" Houston greeted him. "I was just riding around looking for strays. Thought maybe I was hiding your stock here," Anson asked. "You ask that kind of bluntly," Houston replied. "What's got you nervous?" Anson's smile was icy. "Why should I be nervous? I don't mind folks riding over my land. I've got stock here after all." "I see," Houston said. "Nice holding pen. Think there's any reason I shouldn't have one?" "Not at all." "Anything else you're looking for?" "Yeah. Seen Maddox Shaw lately?" "No, and I wouldn't care to. Not a fan of his style." "I thought he was a friend of yours." "Not me." "Why'd you think that?" "Missing any stock?" "Not that I know of." "Why? You think he's been rustling?" "Somebody has, Anson. I just picked up some stock with altered brands. Some of it's mine, some from my neighbors. But none of yours, only the horse Maddox was riding. Come down to my place sometime and claim it." Houston turned his horse to leave, but Anson called after him. "Wait a minute. Did you catch Maddox? You think we'd let him go with the stock?" Anson's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, and he tapped his saddle horn thoughtfully. "So, what did he say? Tried to talk his way out, I bet." "Well," Houston replied slowly, watching Anson's face, "you know Maddox talks tough until he gets scared. Then he spills it all. Come by and get your horse, Anson." Houston turned and rode off, leaving Anson sitting in silence, watching him disappear into the woods. Then Anson slammed his fist on the saddle horn. "Damn that big-mouthed ox," he cursed. "Should have shut him up last night. Who knows what he's told them." Houston rode along the creek trail to Amos Church's place, finding the old man at a corral watching his hands break a colt. Houston shared the news of his visit to Anson, the fight with Shaw, and the morning's events, including backtracking the calves to Anson's corral. Church slumped onto a stump, his shoulders sagging. "So Anson's a thief," he sighed. "Can't say I'm shocked. Never liked the look in his eyes. Too shifty." "It's not proof for a hanging," Houston admitted, "but it ties together. Some of the stock is yours, and I've got it at my place till it's sorted. Figured you'd want to know." The old man stayed silent, then said, "I'm too old for this. Thought I'd live out my days in peace, but it doesn't look that way. If you need anything, Cody, call on me. Not much you can do right now, thanks. Just wanted to keep you informed." "Yeah," Church murmured absently. "Enid's been seeing him. Didn't want her to, but she did. She's lonely, no mother. I'll have to tell her." "Maybe best not to mention it yet," Houston suggested. "Until it's settled, it might not help if Anson knows we're too interested. I want to dig into his dealings at Deer Lick first." Church rose, showing his age, and headed for the house. "She can't see him anymore," he repeated. "Not my daughter." Houston mounted and rode out. After he left Anson at the corral, Anson sat on his horse for a long time, one leg hooked over the saddle horn, thinking about what he'd heard. Knowing Maddox's tendency to talk too much, he accepted Houston's statement about Maddox's weakness, and assumed that upon capture, Maddox had told Houston about their deal. But reflecting on the conversation, he realized he'd learned little from Houston. Houston hadn't revealed what led him to capture Maddox, who was with him, or what they'd done with Maddox after. Anson, a cautious and far-sighted man, didn't blame himself for missing details, but chalked it up to his shock at the news, during which Houston had left abruptly. Not knowing if Maddox was still alive to witness against him posed a threat. He needed to silence Maddox as soon as he could manage. Recalling the conversation, it dawned on him that Houston had caught him in a lie when he claimed he hadn't missed any stock. People would know that he would have known it if his saddle horse had been taken from his barn lot, and the lie would go against him. He could not claim that he had innocently lent the horse to Maddox, for he had already said he had not seen the man and did not like him. His instinct and his knowledge of the fact that Houston and Silas, for whom Maddox had been working, were at each other's throats, warned him that there was more to this than appeared on the surface, and he was not a man to see a storm cloud rise without preparing for it. He looked at his watch, then turned his horse and rode about 2 miles to a small clearing in a clump of pines a little distance from the creek bank. And here he found Enid Church, as he had met her one morning some months ago, and afterward by appointment or common expectation of the meeting, many mornings and afternoons since. She had a habit of riding here with her .22 rifle, leaving her horse in the clearing while she hunted squirrels in the pecan and hickory trees, and then coming back here to rest. Anson found her sitting on a log with her morning's bag of 3 squirrels lying on the ground, and the rifle leaning against the log. He dismounted, sat down beside her, fashioned a cigarette for himself, and smoked it through before either spoke. Then she said, "You act as though the mountain had fallen on you, Hugh. What's the matter with you?" "Nothing. Sorry. I was just thinking, I guess. I've been thinking a lot lately." "So have I," the girl smiled. "But thinking doesn't get you anywhere. It's bad for the digestion." Anson did not acknowledge the attempted humor of her statement, but lapsed into his silence again. "Well, say something," she urged. "Get it off your mind." "There's trouble coming to this range," he said, "and it makes me sad. I don't like to see it." "It might not amount to anything," she answered. "But it will. Houston has come to me twice to get my help, but I've had to turn him down. I don't like bloodshed." "You're like my father, Hugh. He turned him down too." "Did he?" Anson asked without apparent interest. "I guess that leaves Houston just about out on a limb by himself, and Silas ready to saw the limb off behind him. It's not right. I feel sorry for him too. You think a lot of Houston, don't you, Enid?" He eyed her shrewdly, and she met and weighed the meaning of his gaze. "Oh," she said with a hint of coyness, "he likes me pretty well. He's not bad." Anson recalled Houston's warning about the girl, and he turned this over in his mind and weighed it, and he did not like the result. "There will be war," he said, "and men are going to die. Nobody can remain on the sidelines. Silas has a lot of gun hands, and for all I know, Houston may have some of his own or intend to get them. They will kill each other off, until there won't be much left of either one of them. Then somebody will step in and take over the land they fought about. Is that what you want to do, Hugh? Somebody will take it. Your father doesn't want to expand, and that girl across the creek from me couldn't take it and hold it, and the little fellows farther away couldn't do much about it. I need more land. Why shouldn't I take it?" The girl studied the man before her and saw new things in him, for there was a burning and eager glow in his eyes as he pictured this thing to her. "Why are you telling me these things?" she asked. "You have told me how lonely and bored you were, how dull it was for you. Well, I've got a way for you to see life, to be mixed up in it, part of it. Life is always a fight, a battle in which the strong man wins. I'm going to join in this fight at the right time, and I want you by my side. Enid, I've been slow to mention this, but I would like you to marry me. Now, tonight. You must have known for some time how I feel about you." The proposal came as somewhat of a shock to the girl. Hugh Anson had made himself attractive to her, and she was not without knowledge that his kisses had been able to thrill her, for he had kissed her frequently of late. She had pictured him taking her in his arms in the moonlight and whispering his proposal between his kisses. Instead, it had come like some business offer in a cattle deal, and she saw instantly that it had come this suddenly, not out of his love for her, but directly as a result of the trouble brewing on the range. Hugh Anson, she saw, was carefully laying his plans to profit by the bloodshed he expected, and he wanted to recruit the strength of her father's house to his side. His proposal of marriage was merely a means to this end. She was furious with him, but she tried to keep her anger hidden from him. She got to her feet and her lips trembled. "Thank you for the offer, Hugh, but I will have to talk it over with my father." Hugh got to his feet and tried to take her into his arms, but she put her 2 hands against his chest and pushed him away. He held her tightly. "You're angry," he said. "I know what you think, but don't judge me yet. Let me finish what I intended to say. I know that your father doesn't particularly like me. That is why I suggested our eloping and being married tonight. I know that once he gets to know me, he'll change his opinion of me, and it will give me a chance to stand by his side and fight to protect him if the trouble spreads." She struggled out of his arms. "And it will give you the moral backing of his good name. And it will give you hope that you can use him to help you loot your neighbors when they're whipped enough for you to step in." The reins with which she had tried to hold in her anger were slipping from her grasp. Hugh Anson smiled at her and shook his head sadly. "Enid, you're excited. I'm not so poor that I'm picking dead bones, as you seem to think. I was expecting to buy from the side that lost and might want to move out of the country. I haven't told you this because I wanted to think that you loved me for myself alone, but the fact is that I'm not a poor man on a little shirt-tail ranch. I've got other property, a big place down at Deerlick. I bought in up here as part of a program of expansion, if I liked the country. You want to get out of the loneliness you suffer here. Marry me, and we will go and live at Deerlick. There you will find people, dances, society, and the things you long for. How about it, Enid? We will have lots of land. We will be big people, important people. And my father being old, you will have 3 ranches anyway, even if you don't profit by Cody Houston's trouble. It would be beautiful to you, wouldn't it? I'm sorry, I'm afraid you and I never did understand each other, Hugh." She turned and picked up her rifle and caught up her grazing horse. Hugh Anson saw that she had read his scheming through his words, and that he had misjudged this restless and unhappy girl. He knew now that he had failed in his plan to marry Amos Church's 20 sections of land. And he knew still further that he would be unable to force Amos Church to stand behind him as he had planned, if trouble struck him. These things were not his fault, he was convinced, but were just an unfortunate turn of the cards at a bad time. Such a bad break could be remedied by a man as smart as himself. He watched the girl mount and turn her animal without looking back at him. He picked up the 3 dead fox squirrels and called after her. "You left your game, Enid. Take it," she flung back over her shoulder. "You can probably find some way to use it." Then the woods swallowed her up. Hugh Anson returned to his own horse and headed it for his home, where he knew he would have to busy himself with a new set of plans. Things were moving fast here now, and he had no intention of being left out of the wrong. The girl rode in her own direction with her thoughts turned upon herself, and they were not lovely thoughts. She was afraid that she was becoming bitter, for she knew that she was lonely, and she was genuinely afraid for herself. Her mistake in her judgment of Anson was a warning to her that her loneliness could easily lead her into an infatuation for the wrong man. She had liked Hugh Anson, who had come out of a world which she, who hardly had seen anything of the world across the Ashfork Mountains, had longed for. He had told her of all the fun and the excitement and the people, and he had built her longings up almost to the bursting point. He had made love to her, and she had enjoyed the experience so new to her, and she had convinced herself that she was almost in love with the man. She knew that within the last few years she had grown into a beautiful woman, and she had been ready to dream dreams of the future. Now all the dreams had been blown away. She saw herself as just a girl with a rifle and a squirrel for company. "You're angry," he said. "I know what you think, but don't judge me yet. Let me finish what I intended to say. I know your father doesn't particularly like me. That's why I suggested we elope and marry tonight. I know once he gets to know me, he'll change his opinion. It'll give me a chance to stand by his side and fight to protect him if the trouble spreads." She struggled out of his arms. "And it'll give you the moral backing of his good name. And it'll give you hope that you can use him to help you loot your neighbors when they're whipped enough for you to step in." The reins with which she'd tried to hold her anger were slipping from her grasp. Hugh Anson smiled at her and shook his head sadly. "Enid, you're excited. I'm not so poor that I'm picking dead bones, as you seem to think. I was planning to buy from the side that lost and might want to leave the country. I haven't told you this because I wanted to think you loved me for myself alone, but the fact is, I'm not a poor man on a little shirt-tail ranch. I've got other property, a big place down at Deer Lick. I bought up here as part of a program of expansion, if I liked the country. You want to get out of the loneliness you suffer here. Marry me, and we'll live at Deer Lick. There you'll find people, dances, society, and the things you long for. How about it, Enid? We'll have plenty of land. We'll be big people, important people. And my father being old, you'll have 3 ranches anyway, even if you don't profit by Cody Houston's trouble. It would be beautiful to you, wouldn't it? I'm sorry, I'm afraid you and I never did understand each other, Hugh." She turned, picked up her rifle, and caught up her grazing horse. Hugh Anson saw she had read his scheming through his words, and that he had misjudged this restless, unhappy girl. He knew now he had failed in his plan to marry Amos Church's 20 sections of land. And he knew further that he wouldn't be able to force Amos Church to stand behind him as he had planned if trouble struck. These things weren't his fault, he was convinced, but just an unfortunate turn of the cards at a bad time. Such a bad break could be remedied by a man as smart as himself. He watched the girl mount and turn her horse without looking back at him. He picked up the 3 dead fox squirrels and called after her. "You left your game, Enid. Take it," she flung back over her shoulder. "You can probably find some way to use it." Then the woods swallowed her up. Hugh Anson returned to his horse and headed for home, where he knew he'd have to busy himself with a new set of plans. Things were moving fast here now, and he had no intention of being left out of the wrong. The girl rode in her own direction, with her thoughts turned upon herself, and they weren't lovely thoughts. She was afraid she was becoming bitter, for she knew she was lonely, and she was genuinely afraid for herself. Her mistake in judgment of Anson was a warning to her that her loneliness could easily lead her into an infatuation for the wrong man. She had liked Hugh Anson, who'd come out of a world she, who hardly had seen anything of the world across the Ashfork Mountains, had longed for. He had told her of all the fun, excitement, and people, and he had built her longings up almost to the bursting point. He had made love to her, and she had enjoyed the experience so new to her, and she had convinced herself she was almost in love with the man. She knew within the last few years she had grown into a beautiful woman, and she had been unable to resist trying her wings in the presence of the only man who had spoken words of love to her. And yet, with it all, she hadn't entirely given her love to this man who was surely 10 years older than herself. Cody Houston stood between her and that last step. She had seen Houston much in her life, for he was a neighbor with only the creek separating their 2 ranches, and she had long carried a childish love for him. When she was 6, she'd resolved to marry him, but he had never suspected it. And now that she'd become a woman, she was convinced Cody Houston still thought of her as a child. She had tried to remedy this, and only last night she had felt she had made him see that she was now grown and attractive. Cody Houston had seen her in this new light, and he had almost taken her in his arms. She rode through the trees with her horse at a walk, sorted her thoughts, and found things were not so bad. She had discovered her mistake in judgment about Anson, and she had shown Cody Houston she was an attractive woman. This gave her mind direction, for now she was free to give her attention to Houston, and set about accomplishing the thing she had decided upon a dozen years ago. And thus she rode up to the Bamlot with a lighter heart than she had known for some time. She turned the reins over to one of the men coming out of the breaking corral, and walked to the house with her father, who had come to meet her. "Enid," the old man said gravely, "I've got to ask you to do something for your own good, and I would like it if you would not ask me my reasons for what I have to say." "What is it, Pops?" she asked, taking his arm. "Anything for you. I'd rather you wouldn't see Hugh Anson. I have my reasons." "All right, if it will please you, I'll promise," she said. Then she added, I'll make a deal with you on it. If you'll buy me a new dress, and a complete new outfit of clothes for Easter." The old man grinned ruefully. "I should have known you'd have to have something in return. You're a shrewd girl, Enid, and shrewd women sometimes get hurt. But it's a deal." "It's a deal, Pops," she assured him as they went into the house for dinner. Chapter 10. It was about noon when Houston pulled out of the creek bottom and rode across his back ranch yard. At the corrals, he saw Slim Longfellow and Dutch Carlton working on the mowing machine, while Boots Wilkerson and his brother patched up the hay frame on one of the wagon beds. Jess Howard, with his mustache drooping mournfully, was repairing a set of team harness. 2 wagons with kegs of staples, post-hole diggers, stretchers, and other gear stood teamless under the shed. Leaning against the barn where Jess worked were a shotgun and 2 rifles. Houston dismounted and squatted by Jess. "Didn't get started fencing." "I didn't want to risk it," Jess said. "Your gunnies flew the co-op. I paid 'em off out of my own pocket." "What happened?" "Didn't like the cooking." "That wasn't it. One of 'em didn't show up last night when the rest came back from town, but he rode in a little after daylight. Seems he bumped into a friend and Silas's bunch of gunnies and went home with him. Silas sent him over to offer them all more pay if they'd come work for him. They demanded their money and all moved over to Silas's S. I didn't want to send Slim and them out in the open to build fence with no protection. It'd be too much of an invitation for Silas to start shooting." Houston took this in without comment for a moment, then said, "You were right, of course. I never liked the idea of gun hands, anyway. We'll have to settle this ourselves." "Where do we stand?" Jess asked. Houston went over the night's events and the morning's developments, and they discussed them for a while. "Looks like you got Silas and Anson both backed into a corner," Jess observed. "They can't very well let things drop till it's settled. I don't see no use in building fence in the face of bullets, just to see it cut between every post the minute we're through, if we were lucky enough to get through with it." Houston agreed. "You boys just stick around the place to see they don't burn the house and barn down," he advised. "I'm going to keep pushing now, until I bring it to a head. I've stirred 'em up enough, it shouldn't take long." Doc Ellis showed up. "That might be him now," Jess replied, pointing to a slowly moving speck of dust up the road. "Bob and them brought Maddox's body, and told me about the fight up at the Gap. I told him to dump it on the front porch. The calves are thrown in Valley Meadow." Merle and them went on to town, and Bob went on home. By the time Houston washed up, Doc Ellis had arrived. The doctor was a large man with a heavy face etched with the lines of his neighbor's troubles. He was quiet and efficient and didn't have much to say, as his duty was to treat the halt and the lame without regard to their morals and without passing judgment. Houston didn't discuss the affair with him, for which the doctor was grateful. "Now, what was it you wanted me to do?" Doc asked. Merle said something about an autopsy. "Maddox was shot twice," Houston said. "If both bullets are still in him, I'd like to have them. As far as I know, Maddox has no family to object to an autopsy." Doc laid down his bag and removed his black alpaca coat. "We'll need to get him laid out on a table of some kind. Out in the shade of that sycamore tree would be good. They made a table under the tree by placing 3 boards across sawhorses, and the doctor set about his autopsy while the other men dug a grave across the road on Silas's property. By the time they finished, Doc Ellis had washed his hands, rolled down his sleeves, and returned to the front porch. "Here are your bullets," he said. The steel-jacketed rifle bullet went through his stomach and lodged against the backbone. The lead slug entered the bone under the eye and lodged in the skull. "It's mashed out of shape, of course, but I'm certain it's a .45. Houston hefted the 2 bullets in his hand, then dropped them into his pocket. "About that rifle bullet first. Given the wound, could it have killed Maddox instantly?" "Not a chance. It went through the intestines and liver, but didn't strike his heart. He'd have died either from internal bleeding in a few hours or from peritonitis after a few days. But it was the bullet in the head that killed him." Houston stored this information and said, "Thanks, Doc. We'll bury him after dinner. Come and eat with us before you start back." Around noon, Brock Silas rode into his place in a black humor. 30 gun hands sat in the shade of the bunkhouse, playing cards, talking, and idling, which did nothing to improve his temper. He strode up and looked them over. "I thought I told you last night that I wanted you to start today and round up every Houston animal you found eating my grass. I'm going to pen them up and hold them for damages to my range if he starts his fencing. What are you sitting around here for?" A tall, wiry man named Red Dog was usually the spokesman for the group, and now he grinned insolently at Silas. "Well, I reckon you forgot our deal. Our wages were payable weekly in advance, and today is payday. These new boys you hired kinda wanted their pay in hand before starting work. So if you want to pay up, we'll take the money and get to work." He watched Silas's reaction and saw his face go blank for a moment. "Don't worry about your pay," Silas assured him. "I don't have the money in the house at present, but I'll get it first time I go to town. In the meantime, get to work." The boys don't like the idea of working without pay in their pockets. You know how it is. A man might get a sudden itch to travel and he'd want his money. Or something might happen to you, and where'd he get his pay? Or maybe you might run short of money and couldn't pay us, and where'd we be? "What do you mean by that hint?" Silas demanded. "Isn't my word good? Money's better. You'll get it." "When?" "The first time I go to town, I told you." "What's the matter? Are you afraid I won't get it?" Red Dog gave Silas a searching look. "Some of the boys thought maybe you'd already gotten the money, and maybe lost it. Maybe somebody came into your house, stole it, or something. Little things like that worry people like us." Silas searched Red Dog's face and saw only the cynical smile. "What the hell do you know about me losing money?" he demanded. "Oh, nothing," Red Dog shrugged. "I just happened to be in the house looking for you early this morning, and I saw your safe open and some blood on the floor. Little things like that sometimes add up to big things, you know." Silas tried not to reveal his worry, but Red Dog's eyes were on him, and Silas saw the man knew he'd struck the truth. "Well," Silas said, forcing a smile, "I was knocked over the head last night and robbed, but I know who did it, and I'll have the money back in a few days. You boys stick around." Red Dog shook his head, still grinning. "No can do. The boys are sensitive to little things like that. They'd feel right put out if you asked them to stay." Silas weighed the situation, feeling a grave worry. Things had piled up fast in the last few hours, and an explosion seemed imminent. He didn't think Houston had anything concrete, but Silas sensed he was being boxed in, that trouble was brewing fast with too many unknowns. He needed these men. "There's only one thing I can do," he said. "I can ride to town, cash a check, and pay you. Want to work until I get back?" "I'll tell you," Red Dog answered. "We'll all ride in with you. Then when you pay us, we can take the rest of the day off and have a few drinks to celebrate our friends joining us." He turned to the group. "How about it, boys? Take your bedrolls, and if you don't pay us, we'll keep going. There's gonna be a dance over at Kiowa tonight, I hear." That broke up the poker game, and the boys got up and headed to the bunkhouse to gather their rolls. Silas's mouth hardened, knowing he didn't have enough in the bank at Kiowa to cover the check he'd have to get Merle Roberson to cash. But that problem would have to wait. The boys were pushing him into a corner, and he sensed he'd need them. They all rode to town, arriving in the mid-afternoon. Silas went on to Roberson's while the boys stopped at the Parisian to wait. Roberson, sitting in his office at the back of the store, listened to Silas's story without comment. "That $2,000 you cashed for me recently, I had to send that away to cover other debts. I need another $1,000 now, if you'll cash a check for me. You know how wages run up." Roberson twiddled a pencil. "I just can't do it, Silas. I haven't got the cash to spare, and I can't get to the bank at Kiowa for several days yet. You'd better ask your boys to wait. They want their money." "I understand. But I just can't cash your check this time," Roberson said with a finality Silas couldn't miss. Silas got up and left the store, trying to piece together the pattern of things that this turn of events had disrupted. He sensed things were going wrong and felt a showdown approaching. He went into a small saloon, had several drinks, and searched his mind for a move to counter this bad break. As he mulled it over, a way suddenly came to him. He threw a silver dollar on the bar and walked to Ron Greer's stable. "Ron," he said, "I don't need those gun hands any longer. They're waiting at the Parisian for me to pay them for next week's work. Do me a favor and tell them the whole deal is off, and they might as well drift." "Off?" Ron repeated, eyeing him sharply. "You and Houston make up." "Not a bit of it. But I can handle him without spending money on those 2-bit gun hands. Go tell him." "You sure you don't need 'em?" Ron asked. "I was going to ride out after a while to have a talk with you. You got any idea what's going on?" "What do you mean?" Ron said, "Come on back here," and led the way to a feed room at the back of the stable where he closed the door. Seated on 2 full feed bags, the men faced each other. "You've always been a friend of mine and a free man with $1, Ron began. "This information might be worth something to you. You saw me with Merle, Houston, and the others this morning. Know what they're up to? Looking for Maddox. So was I, and I found him first and killed him. Caught him running stolen cattle over the mountain." Ron shook his head. "That's just part of it. You and Houston are at each other's throats, and Bob Burnham is with Houston. You know they got a case against you." "A case of what?" Silas asked sharply. "Murder." "I didn't hear all they said, with them keeping their heads together. They found money in Maddox's pockets that Merle remembered giving you. They know you covered something up by not mentioning it, and they think it was money you paid Maddox for killing A. Flat Sterling. Also, they figure you didn't have a shootout with Maddox on the mountain, you murdered him. 2 bullets, different calibers, fired a long time apart. The first bullet wouldn't have killed him but would have wounded him and knocked him down. So, you must have fired the second one to shut him up when you heard the posse coming. You had both guns, Silas. Maddox didn't have one when we got there. They call that murder, and they're going to make a case against you with it. Murder, Silas. Houston aims to put your neck in a noose. And what are they going to use for evidence? The sound of those shots. Them 2 bullets in Shaw's body. Merle sent Doc Ellis out to Houston's to cut them out of Maddox. And Houston is going to hold those bullets and hang me with them, is he?" "Yep." Silas got to his feet. "I won't forget that, Ron. Just as soon as I get things straightened out around here, I'll show you how much I appreciate it. So he's going to hang me with those bullets, is he?" "He can dang near do it," Ron said. "Them 2 bullets, and the whole posse hearing how far apart them shots were, and the money and everything. They don't think you told a straight story." Silas turned and went out the door. "Thanks, Ron." I'll sure fix you up for that. Just as soon as I attend to a few other matters. Go on down to the Parisian and break the news to those gunmen like I asked you, will you? I've got an errand to do." He started out, paused uncertainly, then turned back and asked, "By the way, they didn't stumble over anything connected with Hugh Anson, did they?" It was Anson's horse Maddox was riding. Anson could give them an answer to that. And Houston backtrailed the cattle towards the creek crossing at Anson's. Then the cattle had been hit on Anson's place. "Sure," Ron grinned. "You was kind of nervous this morning. Your story about finding the stuff at Maddox's didn't check with Houston. He smelled it and got busy looking for things to tear it apart. You'd better figure some way to cover yourself." "Yeah," Silas said absently. "I think I've got a way. I'll be seeing you." Silas speeded up his steps to his horse, mounted, and rode out of town rapidly. Chapter 11. The afternoon had begun to cool when Silas rode into Hugh Anson's clearing. Anson saw him from where he was chopping firewood. He buckled on the pistol he had laid on a stump and came forward to meet Silas, his face deliberately blank. Silas said, "Wanted to have another little talk with you, Anson. Thought maybe we could still get together." He made an effort to sound agreeable, but his tone was forced. He neither liked nor trusted Anson. He'd seen too many of his own traits in Anson to feel anything but suspicion, and only the pressure of the growing danger that threatened him brought him here. Anson pointed briefly to a stump, then sat down on a log facing him, rolling a cigarette in silence. He made it clear by his silence that Silas should do the talking. Silas saw this maneuver and grew angry, but he kept his rage in check. "We should have managed to get together before," Silas said, trying to sound persuasive. "We've almost got to now. For our own profit and protection." "Protection?" Anson arched an eyebrow. "Yes. You need it, same as me. I'm doing you a favor telling you this, but here it is. Houston's got the dead wood on you. You've been sleeping stock around here ever since you showed up, and now Houston's got you over a barrel. He's tracked the stuff back here, got your horse and the stock on his place, with the brands vented to that D&C brand you use at Deer Lick. He knows everything about you, Anson, same as I do," Silas lied. "About your being too handy with a gun down on the Brazos River 5 years ago, and about a whole herd that disappeared on the St. Joe Trail a year before that." "Now listen," Anson snapped. "Maddox Shaw couldn't have told him those things because he didn't know them." "Who said Maddox Shaw told him? A dead man can't talk, and you owe me for seeing to that." "Oh, Maddox is dead, is he? Houston didn't mention that." "Didn't he?" "Anson, Houston hasn't told half he knows about you. He's got a rope around your neck, unless you get busy fast." "About this Texas business," Anson asked. "How'd you and him find that out?" "I suppose he found it out like I did. I made a point of backtracking you. You've got a hell of a lot of interest in my affairs." "Why?" "I spotted you a long time ago, and I like to know who I'm dealing with. Maybe Houston feels the same, but for a different purpose. Anson, you can save your neck, and I'm willing to help if you'll help me. You know this fence trouble. If you were to protect yourself by seeing that Houston wasn't around to hang you, it would of course solve my problem too. In short, if Houston wasn't around, we'd both be in the clear. I'm offering to help you." Anson sat and reviewed Silas's proposition, seeing clearly some of what lay behind it and suspecting more. He recognized that Silas had held back this trump card for a moment of desperation, which meant he must be in a tight corner. Silas had walked right into his web, and Anson had him where he wanted him. "You want everything on the other side of the creek," Anson said. "You planned to marry the Sterling girl and kill Houston, and you would have wanted to marry the girl before killing him, since she might not have married you with blood on your hands. But Houston's found out you hired Shaw to kill her father, and she might know it by now too. So you've got to get Houston out of the way before he hangs you, And you want me to do the killing to keep your hands clean. That's what you're saying, Silas, isn't it? What do you mean? I had Sterling killed. Stop it, Anson snapped. I get around. You're scared to face Houston with a gun, and you want me to kill him. Well, what's your offer? Silas saw that this man's mind was almost a match for his own. He hated and feared him a little. But he figured that once Anson had pulled the trigger on Houston, he, Silas, could kill Anson as a cattle rustler and have his problem solved. Houston's blood wouldn't be on his hands, and he could still persuade Ginny Sterling to marry him. That would open up a lot of land, Houston's, Anson's, and Sterling's. Now you're talking sense, he said to Anson. What do you want out of the deal? It would be nice if you and I, who understand each other, were neighbors. You having all of one side of the creek, and me the other. Silas looked at him with a sly grin. Enid Church, eh? She's a fool. I wouldn't want to be bothered with her. I see, Silas said. Well, the old man's old and hasn't got much time left anyway. I suppose Church doesn't like you any more than Sterling liked me. That's unhealthy, as A-flat learned. All right, Anson. I'll help you. As soon as you're ready, after we get rid of Houston. Anson said, I knew we could get together. He knew Silas had no intention of helping him kill Church later, because Silas would have to close Anson's mouth as well as Houston's. Houston had to go, not for Silas's sake, but for his own safety. Then Anson could play the same game Silas intended, only better. But first, having Silas along when he faced Houston would be useful. Anson got to his feet. When do we move, partner? Now, Silas snapped. The quicker, the better. It had been several years since Hugh Anson had lived by his fast gun, and he had hoped those days were behind him. But now they'd caught up with him. He examined his feelings, and found he was going into this with the same cool, nerveless ease that had helped him before. Nothing had changed. His plans were in jeopardy, and he'd have to eliminate a couple of men in his way. It was just that simple. Have you thought of anything to cover us? Anson asked. He suspected Silas had manufactured a scheme to throw the guilt on him, and he wasn't surprised by Silas's answer. I've thought of that, and the answer is foolproof. Houston was at your place alone today. Once he's taken care of, you can say he caught you unarmed, accused you of rustling his stock, and threatened to shoot you next time he saw you armed. You'd then be justified in defending yourself. Simple, and who could deny it? As I recall, Anson said slyly, you were going to be in on this. What's your alibi? Same as yours. Houston seemed to have lost his head, going around threatening all of us. I ran into him near your place here, and he told me the same. Simple enough. But who's going to believe it? With him dead, who's going to deny it? In this case, I don't think a complicated story would work, do you? Suits me, Anson agreed, convinced Silas intended to turn his own gun on him once he'd killed Houston. But Anson had his own plans. Only one of the three could live, and he intended to be that man. That was his only safety. One more thing, Anson said. Where and when do we corner this gent? One of my boys saw him riding to town with Doc Ellis. I imagine he's trying to get a committee to drag us out and string us up, then give us a fair trial. I've got 3 of my regular riders who aren't too squeamish about laying a gun on Houston if there's a bonus in it. We'll go by my house, pick them up, head into town, spread out, find Houston, and settle this once and for all. I'll saddle up, Anson said, and be with you in a minute. Way things are, what can we lose? In a place with formal law, this group of men would be called a grand jury. But in Ash Fork, where there was no legal structure and no government officers, it was simply a committee of responsible businessmen and ranchers. Merle Roberson had invited them into the private room in the back of his store to hear about a situation affecting them all. They'd hear the facts, and if those facts warranted action, they could appoint others from the decent element to act as a court and carry out any judgments handed down by that court. Under different circumstances, such a court might be called a kangaroo court and subject to criticism. But in the world these people lived in, it was the only way they had to govern themselves. A dozen men now sat in Roberson's room, men whose integrity and fairness couldn't be questioned. At the head of the pine table sat old Amos Church, his shoulders bent with the weight of hard years, his face marked by his experiences with the good and the bad in people. Despite the lawlessness he'd seen and been part of, his face held the mellowing of a life well and justly lived. Merle Roberson began to explain why he'd gathered these men in secret while Houston, sitting beside him, listened. You all know there's been some disagreement between Cody Houston and Brock Silas about Cody's plan to fence his place. The things he's here to tell you don't relate to that problem, though it's what brought these matters to a head. You'll remember that my brother-in-law, A. Flat Sterling, was shot about a year ago in what was thought to be a hunting accident. Houston saw the bullet taken from Ab's body, and it wasn't one that could have come from Ab's Winchester. Instead, it was a lead bullet, like those used in old Krag ammunition. With nothing but suspicion, Cody kept the bullet and said nothing, but recently he discovered that Maddox Shaw owned a Krag. He hoped to prove that Maddox Shaw killed Ab, possibly at someone else's bidding. But Maddox was shot and killed this morning, and those of us there believe it was outright murder. No one actually saw the shots fired that killed Maddox, but everything points to one conclusion. If it was murder, it might have been to silence Maddox so he couldn't testify against anyone in Ab's case. We base this belief on the fact that Maddox was mortally wounded by the first shot, but wasn't killed outright, so he couldn't have fought back. Later, he was shot through the head and killed instantly at close range, while a dozen of us were close enough for our horses' hoofbeats to have been heard. What purpose, other than silencing him, could there be for killing a mortally wounded man? Houston has a personal quarrel with Brock Silas, so he doesn't want to pass judgment. And as Ginny Sterling's uncle, I'd have to disqualify myself due to a personal interest. So, we've asked you to come here to hear the case Houston makes, to call witnesses who can verify his claims, and decide if there's cause to appoint a court to establish the guilt or innocence of Brock Silas. Cody, if they're ready, tell them your story. Cody Houston stood up, placing the old Krag bullet on the table, along with 2 bullets taken from Maddox Shaw's body. He then told his story from start to finish, pointing out the proven facts and the parts that were assumptions. He quoted Dr. Ellis's opinion on Maddox Shaw's death, spoke of the stolen cattle troned back to Anson's Deerlick operations, and noted they might not be connected to this case. He also mentioned the money found on Shaw and Silas's failure to report its ownership or loss. When Cody was done, Merle went out and returned with Shaw's Krag rifle and the package of money. The committee matched the lead to the remaining live ammunition. They sent for Dr. Ellis, Ron Greer, and other posse members, questioned them under a promise of secrecy about the proceedings, and dismissed them. Later, they asked Houston and Merle Roberson to leave the room while they deliberated. They discussed the matter for an hour, then called in Roberson and Houston. Old Amos Church spoke. We're convinced that Maddox Shaw killed A. Flat Sterling, perhaps at Brock Silas's instigation, but with Shaw dead we have only speculation. So we don't feel that Brock Silas can be tried for Ab's death. However, even with circumstantial evidence, we believe Brock Silas murdered Shaw. It's a close call. If Silas or any of us had caught Shaw stealing our cattle, and Shaw fought back, killing him would have been justified. But the evidence and witnesses show that didn't happen. There's no proof Shaw put up a fight. In fact, when the posse arrived, Silas had his pistol in hand and his rifle leaning against a tree. There's no indication Shaw tried, or even could have defended himself. We believe Brock Silas should be tried for murder, and Hugh Anson for cattle rustling while we're at it. We'll appoint a judge, a jury, and a prosecutor. Silas will have a defender. Silas will need to be brought in, though he may not recognize our right to try him. Houston, As the one who brought this matter forward and considering the risks involved in capturing Silas, it seems fair that we appoint you to bring him in. If that's the committee's wish, I'll try to bring him to you, Houston answered. Chapter 12. As Houston walked toward the front door of Roberson's store, he was still surprised by the committee's decision to have him pick up Brock Silas. Roberson, who accompanied him to the door, said, "It might make more sense than it looks, and I'd credit that idea to Amos. Call it a kind of test. If Brock Silas is on solid ground, he'll be glad to clear his name. If he's guilty, he might object and fight back, showing his hand. And since you're the one who unearthed this trouble, it wouldn't be right for someone else to fight your battle and maybe get killed. And if the committee thinks he's guilty, if you and Brock did clash, well, you'd have official backing. It's not a bad idea." Roberson turned to help a woman customer, and Houston stepped out onto the boardwalk where he met Enid Church. She was in high spirits, like a girl with a new toy. "Hello, Cody," she smiled. "I was looking for my pops. Seen him anywhere?" "Yes, he's busy with some men in the back room right now," Cody replied. "You look happy." "Who wouldn't be, with the Easter dance coming up in 2 weeks? I made Pops bring me down to Mrs. Turner's. She's making me the prettiest dress you ever saw. Now, if I'm lucky enough to have some poor lonesome cowpoke take me to the dance, I'll be ready." Cody's eyes caught sight of a buggy emerging from the dusk, and he watched it, missing the coy look she gave him. "Don't worry about that," he said absently. "You're pretty enough to get all the escorts you can handle." "Do you think so?" she asked. "Are you going?" The buggy stopped at the livery stable, and Houston watched the 2 occupants disembark. He didn't have an answer for the girl, who noticed where his attention lay. Old Bob Burnham stepped out of the buggy and helped Ginny Sterling alight. "Lot of people in town tonight," the girl remarked with a hint of malice. "Yes," Houston replied vaguely. "Well, it was nice seeing you again. I'll have to run along." He started to leave, but the girl took his arm. "Cody," she said, and there was an intense tone in her voice that brought Houston's attention back to her. "Cody, I've got to tell you something." He looked at her, and she didn't release his arm as she glanced down the street, noticing Ginny Sterling watching them. "You know, Cody, that our families have always been close. We've been good friends. You promised you wouldn't tell Pops about me seeing Hugh Anson. Well, I can repay that favor, Cody. I wouldn't tell you so much of my private affairs if I didn't think you and I were close. Don't tell me you've married him." "No, Cody, and I won't. He's bad. I just learned it from his own lips. He intends to see you ruined, or at least stand by and watch you destroyed, then take your land. He might have even killed you if he had to. I wouldn't put it past him." "Thanks for telling me," Houston assured her. "But don't worry about him. I'm not worried about his hurting me." The girl's hand pressed his arm tighter as her glance went again to Ginny, who was approaching with Bob Burnham. "But I am, Cody. I'm terribly worried." "Forget it, like I'm going to do," Cody Houston answered. He tipped his hat. "I'll see you later. Right now, I've got an errand to run." He walked over to meet Bob Burnham and Ginny, thinking of the last time he'd seen her when he kissed her, and she turned and fled. He hadn't had much time to ponder her reaction, and wasn't sure how she felt toward him. When he stopped in front of them, he studied her face, noting she seemed troubled by a strong emotion. He didn't know what it was, but suspected she was angry with him. Without waiting for a greeting, she asked, "Cody, why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" He didn't enjoy dodging questions, but he couldn't follow her quick mind. He had no intention of criticizing Brock Silas to her, which might rouse her defense of him. He wanted that judgment to come from others once they'd made a decision. She was blunt, driven by her emotions. "Bob told me everything. I knew something was up when he stayed out all night, and I made him tell me." "Why didn't you tell me?" Bob jumped in to defend himself, though he looked sheepish. "Look, Cody," he said. I explained that you wouldn't accuse Brock unless you knew what you were doing, but you know how she is. She just wormed it out of me. Forget it, Bob, Houston answered, then said to Ginny, I know Silas is a friend of yours. I'm not trying to persecute him or drive him out of the country. If he's innocent, I'll face the music. You shouldn't have come to town tonight. He still couldn't read her intentions, but she offered a reason for being there. I came to see Merle, she explained. I've got to know what the end of this is going to be. It might be a good idea for you to talk to him, Houston agreed. He saw that Bob hadn't fully convinced her of Silas's character, and that her belief in the man wasn't fading easily. It might be a good idea for you to see him with me. Or it might be even better if we could find Brock for us all to sit down and talk it over, she countered. This hurt him. He looked at her with eyes newly opened to her after the kiss from last night, seeing things in her he hadn't noticed before. She was no longer the tomboyish neighbor girl with a freckled face and a knack for tormenting a young man, but a beautiful woman with a depth of spirit, fire, and the promise of a steadfast love for the man who won her. He saw all this and realized he had seen it too late. His chance had come and gone before he'd known it. His instinct told him that by attacking the man she admired, he'd likely ruined his own chances of earning her loyalty, as she wasn't one to be won by underhanded tactics. Houston saw he couldn't come to her under these circumstances, yet this situation wasn't of his own making. He'd begun fencing his land for sound reasons, hoping to convince her to do the same. When this failed, he'd hoped Silas's true motives for opposing the fence, based on greed, would reveal themselves to Ginny. This would, he believed, convince her to protect her land from Silas before he diminished its value. His only purpose was to defend a friend's interests, not to fight over the girl's affections. The bitter realization struck him now as he looked at her beauty, that in protecting a friend, he'd possibly destroyed his chance at happiness. I'm sorry, he said with sudden weariness, but I can't go with you right now. I've got an errand to do. Ginny looked at him with a strange expression. She's pretty, isn't she? And mysterious. Who? Houston's face showed blank surprise. Enid. She's a lovely girl, and the man who wins her is to be congratulated. Enid Church had been so far from Houston's mind that it took him a moment to catch Ginny's implication. I don't have time for dates right now, he said, watching her take Bob's arm and walk toward Roberson's store. He then turned and went down to a side street restaurant, where he ordered supper. It was dark now, and he felt tired and hungry, not in a good mood. Somehow, everything he'd endured in the past 2 days no longer seemed worth the trouble. He didn't relish having to ride out to Silas's and bring the man in. Old Ron Greer sat in front of his elite livery stable, his chair tilted back against the wall under the entrance light, when 5 horsemen rode in and dismounted. Ron stood up to tend to the horses. Howdy, Brock. Howdy, Anson. Town's kind of filling up tonight. You'd think there was a dance or something. Silas wasn't in the mood for humor. Don't unsaddle them. Just water and feed 'em, then put the bridles back on and leave them standing. Reckon you ain't staying long, Greer commented. No, we're not. You said the town was filling up. Who's in? Oh, Amos Church and his daughter came in for some shopping. Bob Burnham's here with Ginny, Cody Houston, and a lot of others. Sounds like a gathering, Silas said. Got any idea if anything special's going on? Yes, I do. But it's secret. I see, Silas replied. So I guess nobody who's not in on the secret knows what it's all about. I wouldn't say that, Ron Greer grinned knowingly. Silas scratched his chin. I wanted to see you a minute. Got a place where we could talk? Back in the feed room, Greer answered, leading the way. Wait here, Silas told the others, then followed Greer to the feed room and closed the door behind him. Now, what is it, Greer? I shouldn't mention it, Greer hedged. I like a man who pays well, but there are some who take and forget to pay. Silas pulled a few gold pieces from his pocket, selected two, and dropped them into Greer's outstretched hand. Greer's face fell. "This is important information, matter of life and death, and I was sworn to secrecy." Silas picked out two more double eagles and added them to Greer's hand, which Greer quickly pocketed. "They're having a committee meeting at Roberson's, and they called us all in to testify." "They've made up their minds," Greer said. "And what did they decide?" "They've got the dogwood on you, Silas. They've decided you're guilty, and they're going to try you for murder. You're convicted before the trial even starts." "Like hell I am," Silas swore. "And I suppose Houston is right in the middle of it." "In on it?" Greer echoed. "It's Houston who's done it all. He's the one putting the noose around your neck. The others are just backing him up." Brock Silas said absently, "Yeah, I thought so." "Well, thanks, Ron. Keep those horses ready." "You gonna look him up?" Ron asked, following Silas out of the feed room. "I'm going to do just that. That Ranahan has tangled himself in my business for the last time." At the front door where the others waited, Silas said, "You three boys go on and scatter around. See if you spot Houston. If you do, come back and let me know where he is. If you don't see him, just hang around and pick up what you can hear. But avoid the Parisian tonight. That's the first place anyone would look for you. Anson and I will be somewhere around." When Silas's three riders disappeared toward the lighted part of town, Anson asked, "What's the word? He know anything?" "Plenty. The committee had him on the carpet today as a witness. Houston spilled his guts to them, and they've decided they're going to hang you and me side by side as soon as they can catch us and give us a sham trial. Houston will be the witness against us." "If he lives," Anson added. "If he lives," Silas echoed. "But he's in town, and I don't see why he should live that long. That man will have wrecked our entire plan on this range if he's allowed to testify. We can't afford to wait. We've got to shoot on sight, even if 1,000 people see it." Hugh Anson had felt the searing touch of a hangman's noose on his neck before, and an old fear resurfaced, convincing him of the need for the reckless destruction of Houston on sight. Then, if there was no way to justify the killing, they would escape. "You're right," he agreed. "And maybe I can give you some pointers on this business. I know a bit about it. You take one side of the street, and I'll take the other. When one of us draws him out, the other stays hidden. One of us can keep his attention while the one in the dark gets a shot in. It's foolproof." "All right," Silas said. "You cross the street. I'll go up this side." Anson glanced across the street, noticing more lit windows in the blocks opposite than on the side Silas chose for himself. As he turned away, a cold smile crossed his face. Anson knew how to make use of the darkness that Silas preferred to hide in. Chapter 13. Brock Silas stood in the shadows beneath the awning over the saddle shop. A narrow passageway lay between the shop and the adjacent building, a convenient spot for a quick escape if needed. From this darkened vantage, he watched the sparse figures drifting in and out of the few illuminated patches along the sidewalk. His gaze kept returning to the lights at Roberson's store, where he knew discussions were unfolding that could alter his life forever. Dark thoughts churned within him. Even if he managed to eliminate Houston and then Anson, who also knew too much for his comfort, Silas knew he still wouldn't feel secure. People would continue to suspect him of the charges, even without proof. Even Ginny might doubt him. His carefully laid plans seemed to have collapsed in the past 2 days, and he saw little hope of rebuilding them here. Maybe he could convince Ginny to marry him and start fresh somewhere else. He couldn't fathom why his fortune had soured so abruptly. He blamed Houston, but it felt as if fate had dealt him a treacherous blow, striking him down just as he neared success. Silas knew he had a sharp mind, able to devise big plans and push through when lesser men faltered and led timid lives. He reviewed recent events, searching for mistakes, but could fault himself only for the lie he'd told after killing Maddox Shaw. The posse had been upon him too quickly to craft a better story. Maybe he'd still get the chance to smooth over those discrepancies. Then he saw Ginny Sterling emerge from Roberson's and head toward him, her heels clicking against the wooden boards as she passed through pools of light. He waited in total darkness until she was close, then called her name. She saw his silhouette as he stepped out and stood before her, still obscured from the street's view. "I wanted to see you," he said. "You frightened me," she replied. "I'm on my way to see Mrs. Ellis." "You can spare a moment, Ginny. This is important." She remained silent, allowing him to speak. "Ginny, I've been the target of scandalous lies spun by Houston. There's no true law here, only what men enforce, and they can't be trusted with justice. I'm in danger. I hate to bring this up now, but I must. I've wanted to ask you to marry me." "Stop it," she interrupted, her voice sharp with anger. "But Ginny, I just left the committee. They're good men. They've told me about my father." "Ginny, you can't believe that. No court would convict me. There won't be a trial. We aren't a court of law. We're just people using our judgment. I know the truth, and I believe, like they do, that you had my father killed. That's enough for me." Her words, full of anger, brought to him a sickening realization. Had he played his cards right, she might have been his. This made his loss all the more bitter. After an awkward pause, she added, "They're going to try you for murder. I'm telling you so you'll have time to leave. If they catch you, they'll hang you." Surprised and feeling a glimmer of hope, he asked, "Ginny, are you still that much interested in me?" "No," she replied, her tone cold. "If they hanged you, it would be no more than you deserve. My reasons are my own." His voice dripped with bitter irony. "Is it any of my business why you're helping me save my life? The committee sent Cody Houston to bring you in. He'll face you directly, not sneak up on you. I don't want you sneaking up on him." "I see," Silas said quietly. "Now it's Houston you care for. Before it was me. Who's next?" "I've offered you a chance to save your life," she retorted. "A chance you don't deserve. You repay me with insults. I have nothing more to say." "You offer me my life only to protect another man's," he said, laughing bitterly. "Houston's after me, and you don't want me to hurt him. Well, I'm after him too, and after all he's cost me, I feel no mercy." "I see now there never was any in you," she replied, then turned and walked away. Silas stepped back into the alley between the buildings, realizing now that all he had left in Ash Fork was his thirst for vengeance against the man who had caused his ruin. Consumed by anger, he was willing to risk staying until his revenge was complete, even with the noose looming over him. He could deal with that later. He was still a clever man. Houston, having finished his dinner, now strolled from the restaurant with a lighted cigar, heading toward the livery stable for his horse. He didn't know Silas was in town, and intended to ride out to Silas's ranch to apprehend him. Near Tutory's bar, a shot rang out from the darkness, knocking him to the ground. His cigar fell, and his hat rolled into the gutter. The bullet had struck his side, leaving him breathless. Instinct took over, and he crawled on hands and knees out of the store's light into the darkness. A second shot splintered the boardwalk near his face. He got to his feet with the wall as his support, and drew his weapon, realizing the shots had come from an alley across the street. He waited, poised, until he saw the flash of a third shot and returned fire. When the fourth shot rang out, he dropped to one knee as it pinged into the wall above him. Hidden in darkness, he made a poor target, while his ambusher, also cloaked in shadows, was firing by instinct alone. The gunman fired one more shot, then paused to reload, assuming Houston was pinned down. As Houston held his fire, he heard Ginny exiting Dr. Ellis's house down the street. Up ahead, townsfolk emerged from doorways. Merle Roberson came out with a shotgun, followed by Bob Burnham with a pistol, along with the committee members. Farther up, 3 men spilled from the Parisian and ran toward the commotion. Roberson and Burnham recognized Silas's men and immediately understood the nature of the fight. Roberson shouted across the street at them. "Hold it up, boys, I've got buckshot in this gun." Burnham joined in, shouting, "Come on over here and stand still." 2 men obeyed, but the third ran down the street. Roberson fired but missed, and Tutory came out of the rattlesnake with his sawed-off shotgun. Roberson shouted, "Stop him, Tutory! Hold him down!" Tutory let off a blast, stopping the man in his tracks, hands raised. "Over here, mister," Tutory ordered, and the man walked toward him. Meanwhile, Houston's ambusher had reloaded. He stepped out from the shadows between 2 buildings. It was Hugh Anson. He shouted Silas's name. "We got him. Rush him." Silas emerged from his hiding place, moving in sync with Anson toward Houston, who, down on one knee and supported by the wall, sized up his options and aimed at Anson as the greater threat. Anson, now in the middle of the street, took a shooting stance and leveled his gun at Houston's shadow. Houston fired by instinct, hitting Anson, who grunted as the bullet knocked him flat. Anson started crawling back toward his hiding place. Silas saw his moment. He knew Houston wouldn't finish off a wounded man crawling away, and if Anson survived, he might talk. Amid the chaos, Silas took careful aim and killed Anson just before he reached cover. Then Silas turned toward Houston. Houston had seen it all. Still on one knee, he faced Silas. "Stop where you are, Silas. I don't want to kill you." "Don't you?" Silas sneered. "That's kind of you." He fired, and the bullet whistled past Houston's ear. "Drop your gun, Silas, and walk over here. You'll get a fair trial." "A fair trial? So they can hang me." Silas fired again, cursing when Houston didn't fall, then charged recklessly. He fired twice more in wild fury, and then, realizing his mistake, halted, raised his gun, and took aim. Houston fired again, knocking Silas into a sitting position. Dazed, Silas lifted his weapon one last time, cursed, and aimed it shakily at Houston. Houston steadied his gun and fired, a bullet straight through Silas's heart. Silas's hand settled onto his gun, and his dead arm reflexively pulled the trigger one last time, sending a final slug into the dirt beside him. Silas's body slumped over his gun, lifeless. Houston, exhausted, dropped his gun and leaned against the wall, a deep weariness settling over him. "It's done," he thought. "And it wasn't worth it. She'll hate me the rest of my days. I'll sell out and leave, far from her." He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, he was lying in a clean bed, with Mother Ellis bustling around him. He heard his friends in the other room, but Ginny sat beside him, right next to the bed. Mrs. Ellis smiled and discreetly left. He looked at Ginny, a keen sense of loss washing over him. "I guess you know it all now." "I'm sorry, Ginny. I didn't want to shoot him. If I had to do it over, I wouldn't. It's not worth it." "You did right," Ginny said softly. "He was vile. I saw him shoot Anson in the back while he was crawling away. Now I know you were right about him. I was blind, Cody." "So was I," Cody replied. "I've made a mess of things. I'm selling out and leaving." "You and Enid?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. "No. Not since I've kissed you. There won't be anybody else." Ginny laughed, a tearful sound, and she dropped to her knees beside him, arms around his neck. Her voice was soft against his face. "We've been through so much. It's time we grew up. How could we live without each other to argue with? We were made for more than to sit and be calm. We clash because we're bound together. And there are other strong moments." He kissed her, tasting the glory of those moments. The weariness melted, replaced by a future filled with her fire, her tenderness, and the joy of a life together for all time.